A confirmation about the audio, please, guys. If the audio is clear and available, kindly confirm the same. Thank you. So, hello, a very warm good evening to all of you, and welcome to Baiju's Exam Prep IES. Welcome to the second session of Environment Ecology, where we shall be proceeding the discussion and carrying the discussion ahead from where we left off yesterday. So, yesterday, basically, we have had an introduction about what this subject is about, why it is important to study this particular subject, what should be the approach when we are going to cover this subject, what are the materials required, what is the relevance of current affairs for this subject. So those basic portions we had done, and then we moved into understanding what do we mean by an ecosystem. There we understood that an ecosystem is actually a set of biotic as well as abiotic factors around an individual organism or a species, which helps that species to live and to survive and to thrive. Now, then we took a look at the both biotic as well as abiotic factors. In the case of biotic factors, we observed that the ecosystem needs to have the presence of producers, and producers can be referred to as autotrophs. So you have two types of autotrophs, photoautotrophs and chemoautotrophs. That is something that we observe. Now, photoautotrophs, the ones which carry out photosynthesis, chemoautotrophs, for example, Nitrobacter and Nitrosomonas, which basically manufacture energy within their body, not because of utilization of sunlight, but because of utilization of chemicals around them, utilization of various different ions around them. So that is what basically distinguishes these autotrophs. Then after that, we observe the consumer community. And in the consumer community, depending upon at what level of the food chain you are, there is a classification as primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer, quaternary consumer, and so on. The primary consumer means the one which directly gains energy from the producer community. Secondary consumer will consume the primary consumer, and so on, as it happens in the case of a food chain. Then we observed that another biotic factor which is important after producer and consumer is actually the decomposers. There we observed the various different stages of decomposition, the 5 different stages of decomposition, that is fragmentation, leaching, catabolism, humification, and mineralization. We also looked at the fact that eventually, after all that stages of decomposition have been carried out, the region is actually deprived and devoid of any organic material whatsoever. So that is something that we observed into. Then after that, we started looking into what are the various different abiotic factors, that is light, temperature, soil condition, water availability, and so on, and how is it that the species they behave when these abiotic factors they are prone to change. So either the species will regulate themselves in the sense that they will adapt themselves to the changing abiotic factor, or they will change their internal body system also with the change in the external environment, what is conformity. Then you have certain species who are able to migrate. If when the situations turns harsh around them, they are able to migrate from one region to another. And then you have certain species who basically suspend their body metabolism or slow it down quite significantly as long as these harsh conditions prevail. And they can go to a prolonged winter sleep, what is referred to as hibernation, or a prolonged summer sleep, what is referred to as estivation, or in case of diatoms and plankton, sometimes the microscopic organisms, there you also have the species which go for diapause, where they simply put all the metabolic activities of the body to a standstill as long as these harsh conditions will prevail. Now, then after that, we looked at the various different types of population interactions and how they are important. So basically, in any particular community, in any particular region or an ecosystem, when multiple species they share the same environment, they end up either sharing a kind of a relationship of a predator-prey, or a competition, or commensalism, where that in which one particular species benefits but the other one is not at all impacted. A mensalism, where one species benefits or one species is harmed and the other one is not at all impacted. Parasitism and also mutualism. Mutualism, which is symbiotically beneficial for both the species. We took the examples of corals and also honeybees along with the pollens. Now, after that, we have come to the topic of the transfer of energy in an ecosystem. How is it that the energy gets transferred in an ecosystem from the producer to the consumer, to the various different levels of consumer, and eventually to the decomposers? We have also studied about the factors of habitat and ecological niche. Now, we come to that aspect of considering the transfer of energy or the flow of energy. So, the flow of energy is carried out from one level to another by from one species that consumes the producer, then that species is consumed, and so on. Now, that transfer of energy is, or the flow of energy, can be depicted in an ecosystem with the help of a food chain or a food web. When we talk about food chain, it is a kind of a linear relationship from the producer. You will have the producer being consumed by a primary consumer, and then being consumed by the secondary consumer. So it is a kind of a linear relationship. So that is what is depicted by a food chain. So when we talk about a food chain, it shows how energy is transferred from one living organism to another via food. And it basically depicts the transfer of the nutrients also within that food chain system. Now, food chain can be considered to be classified as two types. In any particular ecosystem, it can be considered to be of two types. One is the grazing food chain, and the other is the detrital food chain. Detritus. Detritus is a term which depicts dead organic matter. So, when we talk about detrital food chain, in that case, the source of energy is the dead litter or the dead organic matter. That is the source of energy. That will be consumed by bugs, various insects. Those insects will be consumed by birds eventually. So, the source of energy in the detrital food chain will be dead organic matter. When we talk about grazing food chain, there the source of energy generally is considered to be the photoautotrophs, right? Plant or the plant sources, they are the producers. And that is the source of energy after that. Obviously, when we talk about producers, they also require energy. So that energy is taken by the sun. Okay. So here, source of energy in the grazing food chain. Energy for the food chain is the producer. And that producer is mostly photoautotrophs. That is the plants. Plants, planktons, etc. In the case of aquatic food chain, planktons become the source of energy, but they also are photoautotrophs. They also manufacture food and energy with the help of availability of sunlight. And then you have the detrital food chain. In this, the source of energy is the dead organic matter. Source of energy is dead organic matter. Okay, that is basically the source of energy in this case. Now, after this, here is a depiction or an example of a kind of a simplistic food chain where you observe that the solar energy is gathered or garnered by the producers, that is utilized by the producers, and those, obviously, when the producers utilize that solar energy, not all the energy is utilized, some energy is even dissipated as heat. And so happens as it is transferred from one trophic level to another trophic level, or one stage of food chain to another stage of food chain. At every stage, you will find that some or the other amount of heat is released, right? Even when you consume food, not all the energy which is there in the food is immediately gained by you. Some of that energy will be lost due to heat, right? The heat, because when you consume food, that also is an energy consuming process. So there also some energy will be utilized. So not all the energy which is there in the food source is basically utilized. Close to around 90% of that energy is lost due to heat and other activities. Only 10% of the energy eventually gets transferred from one level to another. So this situation that you see, where a plant is consumed by, let's suppose, a caterpillar, which is consumed by a bird, which is then consumed by an apex predator or a hunter. Now, this is the example of a grazing food chain. This basically is an example of grazing food chain, where the source of energy is basically those primary producers, right? They are your source of energy. So that is the depiction of a grazing food chain. But at any point of time, let's suppose from this itself, from the plants itself, few leaves, few seedlings, etc., they have basically fallen off the plant. Now they become dead leaves. Now, dead leaves can be a source of decomposition, right? A source of food for the decomposers, actually, right? Let's suppose plants are consumed by caterpillar. Now, this caterpillar, maybe it dies. So that also will serve as a food for the decomposers. So that will again feed to the detrital food chain. Let's suppose this bird dies. Now that also will serve as a food for the decomposers. That will also serve as an input for the detrital food chain. So the detrital food chain can have its source from any stage of the grazing food chain. Okay? A prelims question can be framed from here. Detrital food chain can have the source from any of the stage of grazing food chain. Okay, so this one that you see is basically an example of your grazing food chain. This is your grazing food chain, but at any stage of time they can fuel the detrital food chain also. Now when we talk about a food web, the name in itself is self-descriptive. You have a kind of an inter sort of relationship between multiple different organisms, where it is not the case that only one species will consume the grass and all the species will be relying only on that particular herbivore. So grass, for example, will be consumed by multiple of the species at the same time. All these species can serve as food to different types of carnivores, and all of them can serve as food source for different type of carnivores or tertiary consumers thereby. So you have a complex web of multiple food chains in existence. So when we talk about food web, it represents feeding relationships within a community, and it consists of number of food chains meshed together. So a food web basically indicates the resilience for an ecosystem. For example, if in an ecosystem only a linear relationship is in existence, that the producer will be consumed by the primary consumer, will be consumed by the secondary consumer, will be consumed by the tertiary consumer, eventually the decomposer. Let's suppose in an ecosystem you have a kind of a linear food chain of sorts. Now at any stage of this food chain, if any of the species is threatened, then the entire ecosystem might collapse. For example, let's suppose if there would have been a scenario where the deer could be consumed only by the lions or only by the tigers, and deers would be the only ones who would consume the grasses. So in that case, either the extinction of the grasses or the extinction of the deer or the extinction of the tiger, any of them can lead to the crumbling of the ecosystem. But let's suppose in this case, if there is an alternative that the grasses can be consumed by multiple different species, and each of these species can be consumed by different species altogether. So there is a kind of a resilience, right? So as diverse a food source that an organism has, it has got a better chance to survive always. If any particular organism has got a very restricted or a limited kind of food source or a food availability, that organism basically is always prone to getting, or it always faces a threat of extinction thereby. Okay. Now, then here, this is the representation or an example of a food web, where you observe these grasses can be consumed by the grasshoppers, certain plants can be consumed, or grasses can be consumed by the rodents also. There are spiders in play, then they can be consumed by the snakes eventually. These grasshoppers can be consumed by frogs, which can be consumed by the snakes eventually. So that is how you have the entire interrelationship between these multiple different food chains in a particular ecosystem. Okay. Now, when we talk about an ecosystem and when we take a look at this food chain and food web, we need to understand, sometimes we need to basically understand how resilient that ecosystem is, how sustainable that ecosystem is, right? Sustainable in the sense that, let's suppose, in an ecosystem you have these producers, primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer. Now, if you want to understand how much energy gets transferred from one level to another, or how many individual number of primary consumers are able to sustain the secondary consumers, how many number of them are able to sustain the tertiary consumers, and so on. Now, that balance of an ecology, that is depicted or represented eventually by ecological pyramids. Now, these ecological pyramids, they end up representing different stages in the food chain. And when we say different stages in a food chain, that is what we identify with trophic levels. So, in a particular food chain, from the producer to the primary consumer to the tertiary consumer, eventually, that each of the levels, each of this position in that food chain, that is referred to as a trophic level. So the levels of a food chain is called trophic levels. Sun is the source of energy in food chains in all the cases. So here, when I say here, when I talk here that source of energy for the food chain is the producer here, obviously I'm talking about after the gaining the energy from the sun. Okay, please don't confuse here that he has said source of energy is producer and there he's saying source of energy is sun. Even the producers, they will gain the source of energy from the sun itself, isn't it? Now, green plants absorb the sun's energy, they carry out the process of photosynthesis, produce food, and those plants are then consumed by the primary consumers, tertiary consumers, secondary consumers, and so on. So observe the trophic levels and the source of energy. So when we talk about producers as in the plants, green plants, photosynthetic protists, then bacteria, then planktons, etc. Now they gain their source of energy is the sun. For photoautotrophs, there it will be sun. Now these green plants, they serve as a source of energy for the herbivores. That is the second trophic level, right? And these herbivores will be consumed by the primary carnivores. So for the primary carnivores, the source of energy is the herbivore. Example, wolf, spider, wobbles, and so on. Now these primary carnivores will be consumed by the secondary carnivores, omnivores, and eventually detritivores and decomposers. They form the end stage of the food chain, of the grazing food chain. Having said that, detritivores, they will also serve a part of the detrital food chain. There also, they can sometimes serve as the end product or the end stage of the detrital food chain, sometimes the intermediary stages also. Okay. Now, here, after this, we come to the concept of bioaccumulation and biomagnification. What is this? So, when you have in an ecosystem a set of organisms consuming a source of food, let's suppose, and then those set of organisms are consumed by another set of organisms, and so on, the food chain exists. If there is pollution, if there is contamination in that food chain, that gets transferred to the different trophic levels. And also sometimes it happens that, for example, an individual species, if it is consuming the food from the same source and that source is polluted, then that level of contamination in the body keeps on building up. Now, that building up of contaminants within the body, due to the source of food, due to the various different sources, etc., that is what is referred to as bioaccumulation and biomagnification. It is the building up of the level of contaminants in the body. Right? Now, both of them are different, but both of them represent the same thing. That in the food chain, the contamination level does get transferred, but then eventually, when we talk about this contamination level, it can either build up in the same organism or get transferred from one trophic level to another. For example, suppose you grow a crop in your field, suppose maize. Maize is a plant, or wheat is a plant that you grow in your farm. Now, you spray chemical fertilizers and pesticides in your farm. So the wheat that you are growing or the maize that you are growing will also have some amount of those chemical fertilizers and pesticides. If you consume that wheat from your farm, maybe some amount of contaminant will also enter your body. Now, because you are growing that wheat or maize in your own farm, you consume it on a daily basis, for example. On a daily basis, some amount of contamination will build up in your body. So overall, you are also a part of the food chain, and the level of contamination is building up in your body. It is accumulating in your body, right? So that is a process or a methodology of transfer of contaminant, what is referred to as bioaccumulation. That is what is bioaccumulation. But what do we understand by biomagnification? When we say biomagnification, so let's suppose the plants are contaminated with insecticides or pesticides. The grasshoppers consume them. So they get that insecticide, pesticides. Then they are consumed by, let's suppose, the frogs. So those contaminants get transferred in the frogs also. And eventually the contaminant level keeps on increasing as you move from one trophic level to the next. That is magnification. So I'll first of all give the written aspect of it. Yes, Justin, just like that. Okay, and here, when we talk about bioaccumulation, that is build-up of contaminants within an organism over a period of time as the food source is contaminated. So here, contamination or accumulation of contaminants occur at the same trophic level. And then when we talk about biomagnification, what is it? So basically, contaminants get transferred through various trophic levels and their concentration levels increase as we move higher in food chain. So that is biomagnification. That as you move across different trophic levels, the level of contamination or the amount of contaminant load in the body keeps on increasing. In the case of bioaccumulation, again, let me tell you again both of the cases. Let me simplify it again. When we say accumulation, accumulation means what? What is the meaning of accumulation? It keeps on piling up in the same place. That is accumulation. So when we say bioaccumulation, let's suppose you have certain fishes in a particular river or in a particular pond. Now that pond is polluted, right? So these fishes, they will consume the food, the same food from the polluted source again and again and again over a period of multiple years. The amount of contaminant in their body will increase. The same case that I told you, when we consume some food, let's suppose which has been produced by a lot of chemical fertilizers and so on. Now, when we consume that food, the level of contamination is there in our body. It gets transferred into our body. We consume it the next day also. More contaminants get transferred in the body. We consume it the next day also. Some more contaminant gets transferred. So as we keep on consuming the same food source, we basically have an increased level of contamination in our body. It keeps on accumulating in our body. That is bioaccumulation. But what is magnification? Magnification basically means from one level to another, the amount of contamination keeps on increasing. How does that happen? So, here, for example, suppose we consider the case of an aquatic food chain, right? What you find in the oceans, for example. Now, in the oceans, you'll find that the producer community is the planktons. Planktons basically they are algae, right? Microscopic algae, which basically are also photoautotrophs. They utilize the solar energy and then manufacture their own energy by utilizing that by carrying out the process of photosynthesis. So these planktons, they form the base of the marine food chain. So let's suppose you consider the phytoplanktons. Now, let's suppose the contamination has spread to these phytoplanktons, and each of these phytoplanktons, let's suppose, have 5 micrograms, even though that is also big, but let's suppose 5 micrograms of contaminant in each of these cells, right? So that is the level of contamination. Let's suppose you have 5 micrograms of contaminant. Now, these phytoplanktons, they will be consumed by the zooplanktons, the krills, right? So it is not going to be the case that one krill will consume one cell of phytoplankton and that's it. The requirement of food is done. It won't be the case. One krill will consume, let's suppose, 10 or hundreds of these phytoplanktons, isn't it? Minimum of 100. One krill, if it can consume 100 of phytoplanktons, then its energy requirement will be fulfilled. And each of these phytoplanktons are contaminated. So all that contamination will get transferred in the body of the krill also. So here, basically, they will be consumed by krill, where let's suppose each of the individual krill consumes around minimum of 100 or 1000 of these. Let's assume 1000 of these phytoplanktons are consumed, right? So in the krills, what is the level of contamination here? If each one of them consume 1000 of phytoplanktons, then each of the krill will have how much amount of contaminant? Let me see your CSAT skills. It will be 5 milligram, right, of contaminant in each one of them. Then these krills will be consumed by small fish, small fishes. Now, it is not going to be the case that one fish will consume only one of this krill. At a time, they will consume minimum 10, 20, hundreds of them. So, when we consider, let's suppose each of the fish consumes 1,000 of these krills over a period of the day or over some period, then what will happen? All of these krills will add on to the contaminant in the fish also. So what will be the level of contamination here? So in these fishes, if each of these fish consumes 1,000 krills, so eventually you will have 5 grams of contaminants in each one of them, right? And then, for example, these are consumed by large fishes such as the tuna, right? Tuna is one of the large fishes. Let's suppose it is consumed by tuna. One tuna consumes 100 of these small fishes. So the level of contamination in that tuna will be how much? It will be 500 grams. Now let's suppose this is hunted by the apex predator, that is the orcas or the killer whales. Let's suppose. Now these killer whales here, let's suppose, each of them, they consume 10 of these tuna, let's suppose, each of them. So if each one of them, they consume 10 of them, 10 of these tuna, what will be the level of contaminant in this? In each of the killer whales, you will have 5 kg of contamination. Right? So observe, in the initial stage of the food chain, each of the phytoplanktons had only 5 micrograms of contaminant. And eventually, in each of the killer whales, which are at the top of the food chain, the level of contaminant is 5 kg. So there is a buildup of contaminant level as you move higher up in the food chain. The amount of contamination keeps on increasing, right? So that is magnification, where the amount of contamination magnifies as you move, or the concentration of contaminant magnifies as you move from one level of the food chain to the other level of the food chain. That is bioaccumulation and biomagnification. I hope that is understood. Okay. So their body get used to that contaminant. Not always. Not always. The body basically can end up dying because of that, because that buildup of contaminant. For example, in the rivers, mercury contamination, or in the lakes, this mercury contamination leads to the mass death of fishes at the same time. Right. Similarly, you have heavy metal contamination, which happens in these fishes many of the times, and those get transferred to us when we consume that. And that is where we also suffer from various diseases. Right. Example of biomagnification could be release of Fukushima nuclear power than fish. Ultimately, yes, it can be. And contaminant in this case should not be soluble. Yes, Pranay, that is correct. What is the example of bioaccumulation? Bioaccumulation, the example can be anything. For suppose even I keep consuming the same food which is contaminated over a period of time, the level of contaminant in my body keeps on increasing. So me or humans consuming the contaminated farm food, that can also be the example. Okay. Bioaccumulation and magnification occur only in aquatic. Why only in aquatic? The concept can be in existence in terrestrial areas also. As I'm giving you the example of accumulation, that I'm consuming the crops, I'm consuming wheat and maize. Where does the aquatic feature come there? Right? I hope that is understood. Is it also changing as a percentage of body mass? Eventually, as you go into the higher trophic levels, Ravi, the as compared to the body mass, the amount of contaminant does not increase that much, but then overall the amount of contaminant, that keeps on increasing. Right. Now, then we come to the ecological pyramids. will organic farming reduce biomagnification? It will reduce bioaccumulation. The contaminants that we keep on accumulating, it will reduce, right? Now, then we come to ecological pyramids. What are ecological pyramids? So basically, the trophic structure and functions at each of the trophic levels, they are represented by the ecological pyramids. So they are shown how the relationship between each of the trophic levels, they are shown graphically with the help of ecological pyramids, where first or producer level constitutes the base of the pyramid and successive levels, they indicate the upper trophic levels. Now, these ecological pyramids are of three types. You have the pyramid of numbers, you have the pyramid of biomass, and you have the pyramid of energy. When we say the pyramid of numbers, so this basically tells you that how at each of these trophic levels you have what are the number of individual species at each of these trophic levels. For example, when we talk about the grazing food chain, in the case of a grassland, you will have the grasses consumed by deers, right? Now, those deers will be consumed by tigers. Now, you cannot have a situation where the number of tigers is more than the number of grasses. Obviously, for every 1 million grasses, you will have maybe 100 deers or 200 deers. And for every 100 deer, maybe you will have 2 to 3 tigers. So that is the number representation, numerical representation at each of the trophic level. That is indicated by pyramid of numbers, right? So here, showing the number of individual organisms at each level. Then when we talk about pyramid of biomass, it indicates that what is the total dead weight at each of these various trophic levels of the food chain. What is the dead weight of all the organisms, of all the grasses carried on together? So basically it will be very bulky, all the deer population, the dead weight of it, and not the fluidic weight of the body, but the dead weight, the organic matter weight of the body, right? And then you have the pyramid of energy, which depicts that transfer of energy from one trophic level to the next, that is depicted by it. Okay, so that is basically the different types of ecological pyramid. We'll take a look at each one of them one by one, starting with the pyramid of numbers. When we say pyramid of numbers, so at each of the trophic level, as we have already discussed, we represent the numbers. So here in the grassland, for example, here we consider the grasses. Right. Now, let's suppose here when we consider the grasses, you have 10 million of them. Very simplistic representation I'm giving you. Then let's suppose these grasses are consumed by the primary consumer or a herbivore, that is deer. So that basically is, let's suppose in that region, you have 10 million grasses, or that will be somewhere around, let's suppose, 100 deer. Now they will be consumed by tigers. So 100 deer might be able to support maybe 2 tigers or 3 tigers at max. So how will this pyramid be represented? If you have to represent the number, so this base has got the highest numerical value of 10 million. And as you go to the top, the numerical value decreases. 10 million is able to support 100 deers, 100 deers are able to support. This is just an example I'm citing. Okay, so that is the upright pyramid. In the case of the grassland, you have this kind of a pyramid structure. Then, for example, in a pond or in an aquatic ecosystem, the base is, let's suppose, similarly, phytoplanktons, microscopic, let's suppose 100 million. Now, then after that, they will support the zooplankton or the krill. Now, they are able to support, let's suppose, 5 million of them. Then small fishes, let's suppose they are able to support 50,000 of them. Then let's suppose a tuna, where let's suppose you have around 100 of them. right? And let's suppose the apex predator or orca, you have five of them, right? This make it 1,000. So that is how this is again an ecological pyramid, which basically is an upright. Tuna is a very swift and a fast moving fish that you find in the oceans, where basically, and it is also very exotic and very, very costly as well. Right. So, Aditya, what is your question, my dear friend? It will be answered. Don't worry. The questions are being answered too. What is your question? The question is, can this also be consumed by dolphins? Yes, the dolphins, they consume that food, the small fishes. Okay. And orca. Orca is a killer whale. Orca is the killer whale, one of the most smartest of the predators that you have in the nature, out there in the nature. They are as smart as they can be. So out there in the nature, they even hunt the blue whales. The largest mammals on the planet are the blue whales. I hope we are aware. So they are also consumed by the orcas. Okay, and Dhanraj, detrital food chain is basically where the food source is your dead and decaying organic matter. So the dead organic matter, such as the fallen leaf or a broken or a dead animal, that will be consumed by the bugs. They will be consumed by the small insects. They will be consumed by a larger insect, which can be consumed by a bird eventually. So that is your detrital food chain. Okay. And I hope that is correct. Understood. Ritu, in Shankar IAS book, pyramid of number is shown as inverted. Is that incorrect? So please, one thing I would suggest, even for everyone, please don't have a book as a reference on your site. As of now, kindly pay attention to the class. After the end of the class, you are free to open any book in the world that you want. But what happens when you keep on looking that okay, in the book this is written, what is being taught in the class, is this sentence being followed in the class? That is a very sort of a school like approach to the studies. Please don't have that. Pay attention to the session. I will tell you what inverted pyramid of number is. I'll tell you what inverted of pyramid in biomass is. After that, you are always free to look at any of the books, any of the text. But please don't bring, because many of the topics that we are going to discuss you'll not find in the book. So please don't, in the sessions, don't bring it up that in this sentence that is given, if that is correct or whether you are correct. After the session, you are free to check it anywhere, and you are free to have all the suspicions out there. And if the question still persists, you are always welcome to send us a mail. You are always welcome to get in touch with us. Okay, but as of now, kindly pay attention. I'll come to that. Now, after this, when we come to the pyramid of number, it is not always the case that the pyramid of number will always be in an upright position. Pyramid of numbers can have different shapes and patterns also. When we talk about the pyramid of number in the case of a forest ecosystem, there it has got a different shape, or even for the matter of that of a tree. Now, that is because in the case of a forest, in the case of a particular region dominated by forests, where you have the trees, let's suppose, here you have the tree. Now, that tree will serve as a food source basically for a lot number of insects out there, right? Lot of insects will be served as a food source. Then these insects will eventually end up feeding fewer number of birds, and they will be consumed by maybe one or two apex predator. So what is the pyramid and the shape of the pyramid that you can accrue here? Here we can think about the shape of the pyramid like this. That is the shape of the pyramid. So this is not exactly upright, But this is not exactly inverted also. It is a kind of a kite-like structure where you will find one tree that is able to support multiple insects. Then after that, you have birds, and then the apex predator. Okay, so that is where the pyramid of number, the shape of the pyramid changes here. Now, it is not always going to remain upright also. For example, when we consider the parasitic food chain, in the parasitic food chain, the pyramid of number actually gets inverted, right? So here you will observe the pyramid of number gets inverted. Number is inverted. So in this case, what do you observe? That one tree will support many of the fruit-eating birds. Now, these fruit-eating birds will be consumed by many different lices and bugs. They will have their source of nutrition from these birds. Now, they will be consumed by many different parasites also. So here, as you move into the various different trophic levels, the number of organisms keeps on increasing. So here, what do you observe? The number of organisms keep on increasing here at each of these trophic levels. So this is an inverted pyramid of number. So always, whenever you come across these kind of exceptions, always try to recall that, always try to remember that, because that can be a very good green area for UPSC to frame your questions from. So in the case of a parasitic food chain, the pyramid of number is inverted always. Okay. Now, pyramid of number in the grassland is upright, in the pond it is upright, in the forest it has gained a kind of a rhombus shape, and then or a kind of a kite shape, because one tree is able to support so many different insects, and so initially it will be like this, and then the number tapers. And in the case of a parasite, it is simply inverted. Now, a bit more representative uh, analysis is the pyramid of biomass. When we talk about pyramid of biomass, we basically talk about the organic weight, or basically the dead weight at each of these various levels, the dry weight at each of these various levels, dry weight of the organisms at each of these various levels, right? Dry weight basically represents the total mass without the various different fluidic system, etc. So here, when we talk about the dry weight is representative of the total organic mass present in the body. Only the organic mass, nothing else. So for example, in the grassland, if you consider all the grasses, now if you weigh them together, they will be quite bulky. You are talking about millions of them, right? So they will be quite bulky. Then the deers are much fewer in proportion, much fewer in numbers. So their weight will be slightly less. Then you have 2 or 3 tigers or a couple of lions, so their weight will even be less. So that is where you will observe that pyramid of biomass for the grassland ecosystem: producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer, etc. It is upright. The total amount of dry weight keeps on decreasing in this. However, this pyramid of biomass is actually inverted when we talk about the aquatic ecosystem. So in the aquatic ecosystem, why? Because here the producers are phytoplanktons. And phytoplanktons, basically being microscopic in nature, their overall dry weight will be very less, because in microscopic organisms, there also you will have a lot of fluid structure. So the dry weight is particularly less in that. So they are actually the least bulky of all of them. And then eventually the zooplanktons, they will be slightly bulkier. The fishes, they will be more bulkier. And eventually, when you consider the blue whale, or if you consider the killer whales, they are the heaviest. So in the case of a pond or an aquatic ecosystem, the pyramid of biomass is inverted. So pyramid of biomass. Ritu, is that understood now? Of biomass is inverted. Answer my question. Sir did not answer my question. Ruhan, what is your question, my dear friend? I don't like the kind of impatience, but anyways, what is your question? I am presently geography studying Majid Hussain sir book which units. My dear friend, is this a session for geography? It is not a session for geography. If you have a query for geography, always request you try to ask it at the end of the session, not in the middle of the discussion, because there are other candidates who are actually here to attend the session for environment ecology. Either ask a question at the end of the session, or send a mail, or get in touch with the mentorship. Okay, please follow the proper channel. Your question will be addressed. It is not pertinent for you to ask a question in midst of the environment discussion. Please don't do that, Rohan. Ravi, so from where is it that this extra biomass is coming from? So that is basically as a result of the body metabolism and accumulation of materials over a period of time also. No, Sakshi, we don't have an extra session tomorrow. Pyramid of tree is not understood. Shalu, so in the case of pyramid of tree, when we talk about, so not exactly the tree in itself. So understand, tree is one unit. That one unit will be able to support how many different insects? Thousands of them. So there will be a kind of a widening of the pyramid. Then those thousands will be able to support only around 90 or 100 sparrows. So it will start narrowing or tapering again. Those 90 or 100 will be able to support only one hawk or an eagle. So again, it becomes tapered. So it is not exactly upright because you have a kind of a widening and then tapering. That is why it is unique. Okay, right? And Ananya, the inversion is basically when you consider the aspect of the weight at of the organisms at each of the trophic level, you'll find over a period of time, or you'll find in comparison, that when we consider, let's suppose, a blue whale. Now, blue whale, which is the largest mammal across the entirety of the planet, will be the most bulkiest of all of them, isn't it? Blue whale isn't going to be a lighter one; it is going to be the bulkiest of them all. So that is where the and if you compare them to the weight of the phytoplanktons will be the lightest of them all. So cumulatively as well. So that is why pyramid of biomass is what? Representing the weight at each of the trophic levels. So if the producer community is the lightest and the weight of the individual trophic levels keep on increasing, so the pyramid that you generate will always be inverted in structure, isn't it? Right? Kishan, number of phytoplanktons are more and the weight is less. Why that is the case? In the case of grasses, the number of grasses were more and the weight was also more. But in the case of the phytoplanktons, they are microscopic in size, very, very small in size. So even if you consider millions of them at one go, still they will not make up a large bulk as compared to a blue whale, right? Millions of these phytoplanktons, if you consider only the dry weight of them, still they will not make up enough weight for few tunas out there. So that is why, unlike the case of the grasses, because these phytoplanktons are microscopic in nature, that is why their overall weight is less. Okay, is that understood? Shiva, can we say food web also indicates diversity of source of energy for an organism? Absolutely, yes, Shiva. Femina depends upon the number of population of the species. The pyramid is determined whether inverted. Yes, that is correct. And how lice and bugs will consume on fruit eater birds. Are we talking about amensalism kind of relationship? Yes, not exactly amensalism, but more of a kind of when you have, let's suppose, these birds, etc. So many of the times you'll find many insects living off their skin, right? So the bird also gets damaged in the long run, right? So and for so it is a kind of a parasitic relationship, if you can. Pyramid of biomass is upright in the case of the portion of the grassland, is inverted in the case of the aquatic ecosystem. Yes, Anushka, that is correct. Okay. In biomass of all organism is considered in biomass pyramid. Yes. Now, the most representative ecological pyramid is actually the pyramid of energy. Pyramid of energy is why I'm saying it is more representative is because it actually tells you how sustainable then and a particular kind of an ecosystem is. For example, and how do we get to know about the sustainability of an ecosystem? If let's suppose the producers are producing food, but as a consumer, you are not getting enough nutrition. You are consuming grasses, but you are not getting enough nutrition. You won't be able to survive beyond a point. And if you won't be able to survive, the higher trophic levels will also suffer as a result. So that means in order for any ecosystem to sustain itself, there has to be a substantial amount of energy transfer from each of the trophic levels, because that is why we consume food after all, isn't it? We consume food because we want that amount of energy. Energy to be transferred from one level to another, right? So that energy, as it is transferred from one level to another, is depicted by this pyramid of energy. And this follows a kind of a 10% rule also. This energy pyramid is always upright. Always it will be upright. I'll show you why. So here, suppose, again, aquatic ecosystem here I am considering. So the phytoplanktons, they are the producers. And basically, here, let's suppose this is the amount of energy that they have. Now, only 10% of it will get transferred to the next one. Only 10% of it will be getting transferred to the next one. Only 10% of it will be transferred to the next one. And the remaining of it will be utilized by these organisms for their body metabolism, for respiration, and will be lost outside as heat also. Right? So only 10% of that energy get transferred to the next trophic level. That is the 10% energy rule. So only 10% of energy gets transferred from one trophic level to the next. Right? Now, because the remaining energy is either lost as heat or is basically uh, dissipated by own body metabolism. For example, if ever you have witnessed a, let's suppose, lion hunting a deer or any of the herbivore. Now, in order to consume that food, or if ever you have been to a national park in India, where if you have been very lucky enough, if you have been able to catch a tiger immediately after it has made a hunt, I don't know how many of you have witnessed that, but it is one of the a kind of a beautifully horrifying scene which you can catch out in the nature. So after a tiger basically carries out a hunt, it consumes the food. You'll find that the tiger simply moves over to the nearest watering hole or the availability of water. And that is where it will consume that water and it will go into the slumber. At that point of time, it doesn't have any energy at all, right? In that case, after the tiger has had ample amount of food, immediately after that, you will find it is absolutely drained of energy. It will sleep for long hours, right? So why is that the case? Because that consumption, that also is energy taking. And also after that, after you have consumed the food, the body metabolism needs to digest that food, isn't it? So that also requires energy. So that is why only 10% of that energy of whatever was the food source, if let's suppose the tiger is consumed, which is not the case, but if suppose the tiger was to be consumed, only 10% of the energy would be transferred to the next one. This is the reason why pyramid of energy is always upright. Because let us imagine a scenario, let us imagine a world where this a pyramid of energy would be inverted. What it would look like. Suppose if we imagine this. where it is inverted. Now, in this case, what does that mean? That means if the phytoplanktons have 100 kilocalorie, they will be transferring 1000 kilocalorie to the next one. They will be transferring 10,000 kilocalorie to the next one. Can that possibly happen? Obviously not. How can a species transfer much more energy to the next trophic level? It is simply not possible. So that is why pyramid of energy is always upright. Okay? And we will have that as a conclusion also eventually. We will basically use that. So, pyramid of energy is always upright. In the case of pyramid of numbers, in the case of grassland, aquatic ecosystem, they will be upright. In the case of parasites, they will be inverted. Why inverted? Because one tree source will lead to multiple birds. On those birds, you will have multiple of these bugs, insects, which will be feeding upon them. Now, each of these bugs, insects will have multiple different bacterium, fungi that will be supported by them. So eventually the number increases. One tree, many birds, many different insects, and multiple of the parasites. So that is why it is inverted. When we talk about pyramid of biomass, so basically in the grassland, it is upright. In the aquatic system, so Priyanshu, I hope that is understood now. In the aquatic system, it is inverted. Right? Now, after this, so basically yesterday we had also discussed these couple of previous year questions which had appeared from this topic. And this is just the representation, the graphical representation of the pyramid of energy, pyramid of biomass in an aquatic ecosystem. So pyramid of energy will always be upright. Under no circumstance will you come across an inverted energy pyramid. That brings us to the next module, and that is where we will study about the various different biomes and also various different aquatic ecosystems. We will also study here about ecological succession, about corals, and so on. So this is a chapter which has been asked frequently in the examination, some or the other bit of it. So here, when we talk about it, so portions relevant for your prelims. Kaustubh, in any ecosystem, how do we recognize whether a certain species or animal is a primary or a secondary or a tertiary? By observing their source of food, by observing that where are they getting their food source. Is their food source restricted to only one organism, or it is multiple of these organisms? So it is by that. So let's suppose a species out there, let's suppose wild dogs. Wild dogs, they will consume a small rabbit, right? So if you observe or follow these wild dogs for some time, you will understand that they are not consuming the plants as a source. So they can never be primary consumers. At max, they can be secondary or tertiary consumers, right? Now these wild dogs, they would be consuming the rabbits, and these might in turn be consumed by a lion or a tiger as well. So that is how, by actually looking at those food systems, you get an idea about that. Okay. Pyramid of biomass can be inverted and upright, both of them. Kishan, is flyways fixed? And if yes, what determines a conducive narrow flyway? So the path of the flyway generally is also accounting for the wind patterns and also in between the availability of ideal food sources. So that in that long pathway, there has to be certain ideal breeding grounds, certain ideal food sources. So that determines the flyway. Yes, Santosh, you can say that. Justin, your question is not very clear, my dear friend. Could you reframe it? Now, in this particular portion, the relevant areas for prelims can be ecological succession. It can be from here, ecological succession. The questions have been asked. Biomes and adaptations. What are the various different unique kind of adaptations that the organisms they undergo in order to accommodate to the newer surrounding or any kind of surrounding? Then wetlands, mangroves, coral reefs, eutrophication, and also biogeochemical cycle. These are the areas from where UPSC has previously asked the question. So, all of you who have that kind of a trepidation in your mind that in UPSC, in environment ecology, absolutely random questions are only asked and we won't have any chance in those. Yes, you have a couple of those random questions. That is why I have suggested to you those docu-series. The remaining portions can be solved if you are thorough with these areas and if you keep your eye out for the development in the current affairs also. You have multiple questions which have been asked from the portions that we have covered or we are going to cover through the PPT itself. Okay, so that is what I am telling you, that is what I am suggesting you. Please try to restrict yourself to the PPT and the current affairs. The more number of times you are able to revise, the better it shall be, along with the additional reading materials, obviously. For the mains perspective, for the mains examination, yes, Kishan rightly said that in this your aim environment for a subject like environment, even for a subject like science and tech, I hope you are not going into the prelims examination with a goal to get all the questions correct, right? Because there will be certain factual questions and you have to be practical enough to understand that it is not about getting 100 out of 100 correct in the prelims. You have to just get enough number to get through the requirement of forest services or the civil services, whichever is the case. Now, then in the mains examination, again, questions have been asked from wetlands. These are one of the favorite areas, and Ramsar Convention, mangroves, importance, coral reefs, coral bleaching, eutrophication and algal bloom. Okay, these are the areas from where questions have frequently been asked. So, one by one, we shall cover this. And we shall start, first of all, with the discussion from ecological succession. And slowly and steadily, we shall be moving ahead. Now, when we say ecological succession, what do we mean by that? So, rather than getting ourselves trapped in these complex terminologies, let us chuck these terminologies and let us try to understand nature as it is. Now, all of us here, we have studied or we are aware about the origin of the planet Earth. We are almost aware about the fact that how initially the planet did not have the condition that we see today. It was not always the case that the trees were in existence, all these mighty trees and well developed flowering plants, they were always in existence like that. No. Anywhere, when a new land gets created, what do you have? The new land gets created how? By the cooling of lava. So you have igneous rock formations, hard rocks which form the new land. Now, from that stage, initially, at that stage, you don't have much life in that area where a new land, let's suppose, gets created. After a few years, after a few hundred years, a few thousand years, you might have few mosses, lichens, etc., which start growing. After, let's suppose, another set of few thousand years, you can have a situation where these mosses and lichens, they will weaken the rocks. Some of the rocks will develop a crack maybe, and from those cracks maybe few plants will grow. When these plants will grow, they will further weaken the rocks. It might get converted into a kind of a shallow soil region, and that soil region will be able to support slightly larger plants out there, right? And eventually, when you will eventually see that the ground is prepared, now you can have larger trees in existence. So it is not the case that immediately after the land got created you can have trees coming into that area. No, you have the evolution, you have different stages of colonization by the species. So that is what is referred to as ecological succession. How initially the set of species which have basically lived in that area, they have modified that region. And as they have modified that region has now become fit for another set of well-developed species. Now those will basically live in that region. So that becomes suitable for the next set of species, right? So that is how you have the initial set of species. They are also referred to as pioneer species because they are the ones who have initially brought colonization to that. And then eventually you have the establishment of the climax community. So when we say the succession, it is the steady and the gradual change in a species of a given area with respect to the changing environment, how the environment changes over a period of time. And it is a predictable change and is an inevitable process of nature, as all the various biotic components have to keep up with the changes in our environment. Now, why does this happen? Why is it that one species leads to the creation of a situation where the other species can thrive, etc.? Because the nature always tries to find an equilibrium. That is why the nature goes for the survival of the fittest, etc. It always tries to find a kind of a balanced equilibrium. So that is when more evolved species take over, more resilient and sturdy species eventually take over, and it goes on. Right. So the ultimate aim of this process is to reach equilibrium in the ecosystem. The community that achieves that aim is known as the climax community. In order to have the attempt to reach that equilibrium, some species they increase in number or some decrease in number. Right. So here, if I were to show you just a graphical representation of it, so if you have bare rocks, initially you will have lichens, etc., which will start growing on the rocks. That will be followed by small annual plants and more mosses, etc. That will be followed by few grasses and plants which can sustain for throughout the year. That will be followed by few of the shrubs, few of the small trees, and eventually a kind of a well-established climax community. So this is the process of ecological succession. So ecological succession in an area, it is a sequence of communities that undergo changes. So whenever in an area, the sequence of communities that undergo the change, they are referred to as seer, or each of the stages, they are also referred to as seral stages. Now, this ecological succession can happen on its own in an area or can be introduced by the outside factors also. Right. Now, this ecological succession can also be classified as primary and secondary succession. We will come to that also. But when we say autogenic ecological succession, that means in that living area itself, automatically the mosses, lichens, they are giving way to the small plant shrubs, they are giving way to the small trees, they are eventually leading to the existence of the climax community. an allogenic, maybe an outside factor, an outside agent has introduced a particular species in a region, and that has suddenly changed how the species evolve in an area, right? So here, when we talk about that stage of succession, the initial stage is that of, I'll give you the definition of all of them. The initial stage is that of nudation, where everything is bare, barren rocks, everything, nothing is there. Then you have the stage of invasion. Invasion, as in, you have the introduction of certain species. Mostly, the very sturdy and the resilient mosses and lichens, they come at this particular stage. That is the stage of invasion. Then eventually, when you have still the communities in a very fragile state, at that point of time, there will be competition, coaction, whatever is needed to survive. Each of the species, they support each other for the mode of survival also, right? And eventually, few of them will get eliminated, few of them will grow stronger, and then you have the stabilization and the apex community, which is, or the climax community, which is attained. So that is the entire stage of the succession. Now, this ecological succession is of two categories or two types. So when we talk about ecological succession, it is of two types. What is referred to as the primary succession and what is also known as secondary succession. Now, what is the difference? When we say primary succession, so this happens in an area where there has not been any different type of life form before, and there has been an introduction of life in that area either by natural factor or by outside factor. So it goes through that phase of nudation, invasion, competition, coaction, reaction, and then stabilization, right? So it is where the example that I gave you, that a new land gets created. For example, in the region around Pacific, in the entire region around Pacific, I hope we are aware that you have thousands of islands there. And many of these islands, they represent certain very unique species, not to be found in many other parts of the world. Now, how do you think these species, they got into that island? How would they reach those inaccessible islands? How could they manage to do that? So basically, these species initially would not have been, for example, an island getting created made up of only rocks. Initially, maybe the few of the waves, action, etc., they would have weakened the rock structure, and where the waves have come, there you would have the development of mosses, lichens, right? So that basically weakens the rocks, leads to the development of certain sandy beaches. From there, you can have certain more plants which can grow. Then maybe a bird passes by, drops a seed of another plant that can start growing there. So very soon, that process of evolution takes over. That is why study of certain islands in Pacific, they show certain so very unique results, because there that evolutionary scale plays out at a very different level than as compared to maybe a connected region like the Indian subcontinent or so on, right? So that is your primary succession. But what do we understand by the secondary succession? Let's suppose, consider the case of a region in any area where you have the establishment and the well-defined establishment of life. Now, in that area, if suppose there's a volcanic eruption which takes place, it flattens everything, it burns everything, everything is reduced to ashes, right? And new rock formations are there. Now, then, as the life comes back in that region, that is secondary, because their life was already in existence and then it has been re-established. Take the case of the region of Chernobyl. I hope you would have heard about the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, where you had significant amount of radioactive materials which started leaking from the Chernobyl plant, and the entire region was almost depopulated of the species because of the impact due to radiation, etc. The plants, they were impacted, the producers were impacted, and as a result of that, the entire community was basically impacted. Now, the biologists of that time, they said that this region of Chernobyl can never be inhabited ever again. You can never have any species living here again for thousands of years because that is the level of radiation. But the irony of that is, if you go to the region today, you will find a very distinctly developed biodiversity in that area. They have come back up, right? So that in a region where you had the establishment of life that got destroyed, coming back up again. For example, Australia, almost every 2 years, it suffers from a very debilitating wildfire event where, due to dry conditions, you have very massive forest fires. Now, forest fires means there is a forest, but after a forest fire, all the species in that region, they basically go extinct or they are basically killed. But again, it regenerates within a few years. That is secondary succession, right? Primary succession is when a new area is colonized for the first time. Secondary succession is when you have an established community getting destroyed and then reestablishes itself back again, right? So, when we talk about primary succession, this is also what is referred to as presare, right? Because each of the stages that is referred to as seer, so here it is also referred to as presare. It is a succession that starts in lifeless areas such as the regions devoid of soil or the areas where the soil is unable to sustain life. So that is where the introduction of life starts to happen. When the planet was first formed, there was no soil on Earth. The Earth was only made up of rocks. These rocks were broken down by microorganisms and were eroded to varying degrees to form the soil. Now, the soil then becomes the foundation of plant life. These plants help in the survival of different animals and progress from primary succession eventually to the climax community. Right? So that is how eventually that succession happens. Now, the species which inhabit that region for the first time, which colonize the region for the first time, they are also what are known as the pioneer species. Right? They are also what are the pioneering species. Okay? Now, secondary succession. This is also what is subseer. So here the graphical representation in itself is self-descriptive, where you will observe that initially you had an established climax community in an area. It might all get destroyed at one go. And this, mind you guys, planet Earth has gone through this secondary succession multiple number of times. We have gone through multiple stages of mass extinction, where at one go, almost 90% of all the species living at that point of time, they simply went extinct. 65 million years back, when you had that massive asteroid impact, not only did it wipe out the dinosaurs, it wiped out many of the life forms on the planet, many of the plants and animal species. Around 95 million years ago, even though it was not a mass extinction, but 95 million years ago, I think we have had that discussion in the geography session if you have attended. 95 million years ago, the planet went through a stage where you had massive volcanic eruptions happening in every part of the planet, and especially underwater. You had a situation where you had massive amount of basaltic lava being thrown up from the various cracks and crevices of the planet. It is, by the way, during that time when you had that lava eruption creating the Deccan traps in our country also. Now, before that uh, event, the planet's oceans were dominated by very large species. Very ultra large species used to survive in the planet's oceans. Because I hope we are aware about, I know I'm digressing a bit, but because we are talking about succession, I hope we are aware about the fact that when we talk about the species and the evolution of the species, the accepted principle and the accepted theory is that you had species who developed on land and they went into water. right? Many of these species. Initially, you had species coming from water to land, but that is when the development happened. You had massive species which developed and then they took to water. For example, even the evolutionary time scale tells us that the giant blue whale that we see at one point of time, these would have been land mammals. As the situation on the land would have gotten adverse, they would have gone to the sea and they adapted there, right? Now, similarly, you had many such large organisms which would live into the sea because the situation on land started changing quite drastically due to continents drifting, etc. Now, all these large animals which would stay underwater, they would require a lot of oxygen, and underwater they would get that dissolved oxygen in the water. But around 95 million years ago, when the entire planet basically erupted, you had volcanic eruption everywhere. You had so much amount of carbon dioxide produced, so much amount of heat produced. It is estimated that the temperature of the oceans, which is presently the hotter portions of the oceans, we consider that the temperature is around 24, 25 degrees Celsius, around 95 million years back, it is estimated to have reached around 40, 42 degrees Celsius immediately. And the oceans were devoid of oxygen completely. Many of these life forms immediately went extinct. But that is the nature of life. That is where new species they come into existence. The older species they are pushed out of existence. Life is always a balance between speciation and extinction. Extinction is the reality of life. Otherwise, think about it. A species which is as well adapted as a dinosaur. You had species of dinosaurs which could fly. You had species of dinosaurs which could live partially in water. You had species of dinosaurs which were herbivores. You had species of dinosaurs which were carnivores. So basically, one species would fulfill all the multiple roles. Even they were pushed into extinction. So many times, ecosystem gets destroyed, gets regenerated, and that is secondary succession. Now, apply your logic here. Which will be more time consuming? The primary succession or the secondary succession? Which will take more time to happen? Good. Always primary succession. Primary succession will take much more time to unfold. But secondary succession happens or unfolds in a very short time window. Chandrasekhar, but sir, life begins with water. Yes, that is true. Life did originate underwater. And that is what I am telling you. There it developed. And there it is said that few of the species they left water and came to land. And as the situations of the land, they started getting very terse around 400, 500 million years back. That is when many of the species went into water as well, right? Few of the species they stayed back. So the blue whale is, so that is why the blue whales, many of their body morphology or the body parts indicates that at some point of time in the geological history of the planet, they would have had limbs as well, right? The four limbs and the hind limbs that the terrestrial species have. So that is basically the circle of evolution or the cycle of evolution. Okay. So secondary succession happens very quickly, whereas the primary succession takes a very long period of time to happen. So happens over a very short period of time. For that matter, many of the people, environmentalists, environmentologists, they have also maintained that it is basically we humans who are getting arrogant, that the planet is in danger. Planet is not in danger. How we want to see the planet, that is in danger. We want to see the planet in a certain way. But planet has never maintained the same stage throughout the history. It has been changing. It is we humans who have the audacity, and we are so very preposterous to think about it that we can have the planet in the way that we want. Only the green plants, it should be beautiful. We can have the cities in between. That is the planet that we will know. Planet has continuously pushed out to various species. Even after we humans go extinct, the planet can regenerate various different types of landforms, right? So that is the situation of the succession. Now, when we talk about nudation, nudation is basically the initial stage. That is when you have a creation of barren area, either by destruction of an existing ecosystem or a newly created area. Then you have invasion, entry of the first successful reproductive species. There you have the pioneer species, which comes into existence. Then comes cooperation and competition, where the species basically they help out each other. They try to have that the climax community gets established. Now, depending upon where that ecological succession is happening, there is the naming and the nomenclature of this as well. This is relevant only for your prelims. So, if succession is happening in water, hydrosphere. If it is happening in desert areas, xerosphere. If it is happening on the barren rock surface, sometimes also referred to as lithosphere, samosphere, and so on, just refer to this list for your prelims exam. Now we'll come to the portion of biomes, and after that, but before that, we'll take a break, and after that, we will come to the portion of biomes and we will move ahead. Could mass extinction be linked with the formation of crude oil? Not exactly mass extinction, but you have the death of the marine species, aquatic species, which have led to the formation. Okay. Justin, what decomposition of aquatic animals? Aquatic, are you talking about the crude oil formation as well? Last slide. Santosh, is there any micro percent of comparison of the evolution of Earth? See, I'm not going to get into that dicey area of mythology, Santosh. I hope you pardon me for that, but I hope you understand it is a sensitive area. It will be absolutely irresponsible for me to make any comment in that regards. And Akshay, when Bhopal gas tragedy, the time methyl isocyanate and had adverse effect on plants. If the plants can grow despite of radiation, will they reduce the half-life of the radioactive material? The half-life of the radioactive material, it was not the radioactivity of the methyl isocyanate. It is not the case that methyl isocyanate was radioactive. Was it the case, Akshay? No, it was simply poisonous, right? So the plants that grow in that area will have that contaminant level, if that is what you are asking. And Anushka, can we say that secondary succession means an area affected by external effects and gets recreated? Yes. Due to this, volcanic eruption led to the block of sunlight, Shalu. Yes. And nudation can happen in primary and secondary, mostly observed in primary, but even after, let's suppose, an established ecosystem is there, it has gotten destroyed there also. You can have that after it is destroyed, that is also a stage of nudation, isn't it? And can we get crude oil from sea? Bhagya, in case you are not aware, wherever you have the crude oil, at some or the other point of time in history, that would have been underwater. Crude oil will get created always in the marine areas. So all the portions of Middle East that you see, which are rich in oil, would have remained underwater at a point of time in geological history. For example, crude oil in the region of Gujarat, that region had been underwater. Rajasthan had been underwater. Assam had been underwater. Krishna Godavari Basin in India had been underwater. Okay. Now, we take a break here and we come back after the break and we continue with the portion of biomes. So, here we take a 15 minutes break and we come back. A confirmation about the audio, please, if the audio is clear and available. Thank you. Kamlesh, the answer is very simple, one worded: evolution. That's it. Okay. So now we come to the portion of biomes. What do we understand by biomes? Dry habitat refers for deserts here, yeah. When we talk about the region of biomes, what are they? So basically, the genesis of this term goes back almost more than 100 years, where you had an American ecologist in the name of Frederick Clement, who basically used this term for the first time, where he basically said, and the understanding was, that across the planet you have different climatic regions. And in each of these climatic regions, you will have, due to the factor of climatic conditions such as temperature, rainfall, evaporation, precipitation, etc., you will have a certain set or a certain type of plant species in existence. Natural vegetation, as it is referred to. Now, that natural vegetation, how it is and what kind it is of, that will also end up determining the kind of animal species which will inhabit that area, which will be living in that area. So, accordingly, various different or larger climatic regions, for example, deserts, tropical grasslands, temperate grasslands, tundra, coniferous forest, that is a boreal forest, like that tropical rainforest or equatorial rainforest, like that, the world was basically divided into biomes. So that is where the first genesis of the term lies. And this was simply in order to understand that why in a certain region you have the animals of a certain specification or species of a certain type. For example, yesterday also we talked about the fact that you will never find small rodents or smaller species in existence in polar areas. In polar regions, generally you will come across larger species. Why? Because the smaller species, if you consider, now as compared to their size, the surface area is larger. So they end up losing a lot of heat and they cannot survive. So you have certain set of species. The type of plants that you find in the higher latitude, in the higher altitude also, they have a very unique feature of a conical shape and a needle-shaped leaf also. Why? Because the climate in which they grow, they will need to withstand heavy amount of snowfall. And that is why they have that modification. That is why they have that kind of a specification built into them. Right? So that is what is descriptive of the term biome. Later on, when we came to, or when you had other kind of environmentologists, ecologists getting into it, Heinrich Walter, a German meteorologist, basically then again went forward and classified these biomes based upon the climatic conditions experienced there. So here, when we talk about it, let us take a look at few of them. So grouping of biological communities and ecosystems into categories based on the climate and dominant plant form. Now, biome is, by the way, different from an ecosystem. Please understand that. If I can so very much dare to take you back here, understand. So you have at the base form the individuals. Group of individuals make up a population, right? Many of these different populations considered together, they make a community. Many of these small communities, they make up an ecosystem. Multiple of these ecosystems will end up creating a biome, and many of these biomes will end up forming the biosphere. So biome is nothing but a kind of a subcomponent, the subcategorization of the biosphere. Multiple different ecosystems will end up constituting and making one biome. Okay, so here, when we take a look at the difference, a biome is a large naturally occurring community of flora and fauna occupying a major habitat. Ecosystem is much smaller, consisting of the biotic and the abiotic components supporting life in a region, right? It consists of many ecosystems that share a similar climatic condition. For example, when we talk about tropical grasslands, there you will have an ecosystem of the grasslands also. Let's suppose you have a pond there. You will have a pond or an aquatic ecosystem there also, right? So like that, in one biome, you can have multiple of them having the similar climatic conditions. But an ecosystem is at an individual level. So this covers a very large geographical area, whereas the ecosystem covers a very smaller geographical area. So they differ from each other. The biomes, they differ from each other based on the climatic conditions. Temperate grasslands, tropical grassland, temperate forest, tropical rainforest, tundra, taiga, deserts. So these are your climatic conditions. Whereas when we talk about ecosystems, you can have, for example, grassland ecosystem, you can have, for example, the aquatic ecosystem, you can have the forest ecosystem, you can have the riverine ecosystem, and so on. Okay? Now, this is the classification which was done by Heinrich Walter, a German ecologist, who divided these biomes based upon the climatic zones. So tropical rainforest, tropical savanna, or tropical, basically, you have the grasslands, then subtropical desert, woodland, shrubland, temperate forest, temperate seasonal forest, grassland, etc. Now, you don't have to go through each and every one of them. And I also gather that when you would have studied the portion of climatic classification under geography, already you would be aware of the varying different kind of conditions in various parts of the world. So that would basically give you some amount of idea. We will cover a few of them, and we will cover them with a different motive. Not to introduce you to what these are, because I assume that we have some basic clue about it, but then also to indicate the kind of life forms and the adaptations that they pursue, the adaptations that they indicate. So we start with, first of all, the tropical rainforest biome. Now, tropical rainforest is present in the equatorial region, around the region of equator. So this is where you have the tropical rainforest in existence, around the region of Brazil. So Brazil, Amazon rainforest, they are also known by which name? What is the other name by which we refer to the Brazilian Amazon rainforest? Very good, Shalu. It is known as selvas, right? Lungs of the earth, fair enough, but it is known as selvas. Okay. That is where you have the selvas. Then here you have the Congolese rainforest, and here again you have these rainforests. Now, in these regions, you will have the availability of moisture to be present on a day-to-day basis, because every day in the evening, in the afternoons and in the evening, you experience that heavy amount of rainfall. So moisture is available, right? Because the plants, they do need moisture, they do need the availability of water. So water is available. To add on to that, here the competition is for the availability of sunlight. Sunlight is what the trees basically compete for. So that is why here you will find the trees, they grow taller and taller and taller. They try to outcompete with each other in terms of the height. Why? Because the taller that they go, they have a better access to sunlight. So here, when we talk about the life forms, very tall trees to access sunlight. They also have large canopies. Large canopies as in, here you have, this is your canopy, right? And you have multiple different levels of growth. You will have few of the trees at this level, few of the trees at the next level. So you have multiple different multi-layered growth. Yes, correct. So here you will find multi-layered forested growth. Now, in this case, here we know that the density of the trees is very high. So when we talk about, let's suppose, the forest floor, will the forest floor get the availability of sunlight in this case? What do you think? Will the forest floor get the availability of sunlight? No. So here, the availability of light on the forest floor is not there. So if the availability of light is not there at the forest, that is why in these thick rain forests, even during the daytimes, oftentimes in the interior, it appears to be very, very dark, right? Sometimes I hope it never comes to that situation with any of you. But even in Western Ghats, sometimes when you go out to trek, right, and in the interior of the forest, because the forest there also in certain sections are very, very dense, there also, in the midst of the day, you feel it gets very, very dark to the sense that it becomes very difficult to walk between the trees and to figure out what lies underneath them, right? So it gets very dark at the forest floor. So if it gets very dark at the forest floor, can the plants grow at the forest floor in that case? Obviously not, because the plants require what? They require sunlight. So due to lack of sunlight on the forest floor, no vegetation. Now, if you don't have vegetation being carried out or on the forest floor, that is the small shrubs or plants, will you be able to find large herbivores in the sense elephants, zebras, deer population, etc., hippos? Will you find them? The answer is again no, because they need that food, isn't it? So hence, large herbivores are not found. Not found. So one of the reasons is also because of the fact that when you consider these large herbivores, they cannot wiggle their way through these narrow pathways which are existent between the trees, right? So you will never find these large animals to be existent in those areas where the trees are so very dense. It becomes, many of the times it becomes difficult for even us humans to go through. Right. So imagine what an elephant would. There is an exception in the region of Indonesia, Java, and Sumatra. I'll come to it. But here, on the forest floor, because you don't have grasses, will there be a food chain in existence on the forest floor? Or will there not be any food chain in existence? What do you think? Obviously, there will be food chain in existence. Now, it is the detrital food chain which will dominate the forest floor. Detrital food chain, you have, let's suppose, leaves which fall from the trees or fruits which fall from the trees. And that is basically going to fulfill the detrital food chain. So on the forest floor dominated by detrital food chain. So see, observe the flow of logic here, right? There is no rocket science involved. One thing or one scenario will automatically lead you to the other thing. So here, or the other kind of a conclusion. So here, other than this, when we talk about this particular forest floor, for example, there, because that detrital food chain is in play, you will find a lot of insects. Insect population is very high because the insects, they do what? In the stages of decomposition, where does the role of insects come in? They play an instrumental role in the process of fragmentation, breaking down the organic matter, leaching also sometimes, catabolism also sometimes. So the insect population is very high. When the insect population is very high, eventually you will have the toads, the frogs also having, or lizards having very high, large number. And that means you will have a high reptile population also. So the reptilian population in this is also going to be higher. Okay, so high number of, large number of insects, reptiles. Along with that, basically, you will find that the bird species and their numbers will also be high along with the monkeys, right? The monkey population, their population will also be high. The arboreal species, their population will also be high. They will be jumping from one branch to the other. They rarely will come to the forest floor, right? Many of these monkeys which live there, they will barely touch the forest floor because they know the moment they touch the forest floor, there are many dangers lurking around, right? So that is why majority of them will simply spend majority of their life jumping on top of the trees. So you'll have a lot of aviary population, bird population, and also monkeys, arboreal species, etc. Now, here, when we talk about these different types of species in existence, eagle population is also high. Yes, fair enough. Snakes are also high. Yes. Population of carnivores. So here, I'm coming to that. When we talk about the soil type, now, here we have already seen that the rate of decomposition will be very high. So the soil will be devoid of nutrients. The soil is very poor in nutrients here, right? The humus quantity of humus is very low, almost negligible. So the plants, many of them, in order to get that required nutrients, you will find the carnivorous species of plants to exist here in this area. Okay, carnivore, carnivorous species of plants. Reptiles also are carnivores, Santosh. Majority of the reptiles, they will also come into the category of carnivores. Okay. So here you will find, for example, Venus flytrap, etc., different species of plants which will have very beautiful coloration of the flowers, a very unique smell of the flowers in order to attract the insects. And once the insects fall into that, that is how they get their nutrition. They basically digest that. Right. So that is where basically you will find the presence of these species or the kind of species that exist. Okay. Rafflesia. Rafflesia is one of those very large flowers which has got a very bad pungent smell. The smell of like a dying flesh, a dead decaying flesh. That attracts various different types of insects, maggots, etc. And that basically the plant consumes it all. Okay, so here you will find that the soil is infertile. Infertile soil due to lack of humus. Okay, if herbivores are not there, then how carnivores will exist? You have herbivores, isn't it? For example, even these insects, many of them, they are herbivores. For example, even if you talk about the monkeys, etc., they are also herbivores. But other than that, you will find various other smaller species of herbivores also. Not the larger herbivores, but the smaller ones, you will find them roaming around. Okay. Nutrient will be high. No, nutrient level is low, shallow. It should be fertile as decomposition process will happen oftentimes. No, decomposition process happens, but it happens so very quickly that the end stage of decomposition is what? A complete dissolution of all the humus, all the nutrients, right? So the end stage of decomposition is reached very quickly. So that is why the soil becomes or remains infertile. Arya, why lack of humus? That is because the rate of decomposition is very high, as we saw yesterday. Carnivorous species of plants, basically Purvi means those particular species of plants which will consume insects, smaller insects, worms, etc. So they basically consume that, right? You have the, I hope we are aware that you have these kind of plant species which consume these smaller insects, flies, bees, etc. So they have that kind of a trap. Venus flytrap is one of them. They have that trap. Pitcher plant is one of them. So they have that kind of a pitcher or an opening where, with the unique smell and the sugar coating that they have on the mouths of that pitcher that attracts the insects, slowly and steadily they start going into it, and then immediately the flap closes, and eventually they get the insects, etc., they get digested in the enzyme system, and that is the carnivorous system of the plants. Humus means the organic matter. Okay. Humus means the organic matter. Okay, all of you are asking the same question again today. Why lack of humus? What is the last stage of decomposition? Dhanya. And all those who are thinking that why lack of humus, what is the last stage of decomposition? Correct? It is mineralization. So when you have that mineralization, what happens in that case? Whatever was the organic matter present in the humus, that is also decomposed. So that decomposition which has taken place, it has basically taken care of all the organic matter which was present, and that has been reduced and consumed by the microbes. So the end process means no humus at all. So if the rate of decomposition is faster, that means at the end process, you don't have any organic matter left. Remember, we had discussed that yesterday. In case you have not attended the session yesterday, that is a different matter, right? We had discussed. So if I can put forward that question to you, if you want, I can put forward that question to you as well. So, for example, if let's suppose, yes, this was the question which was asked this year. Are we ready to take this question? Should we discuss this question? So, okay, fair enough. Discuss this question. We go ahead with this question. So, this is a statement-based question which was asked in 2023. The soil in tropical rainforests are rich in nutrients. And statement 2. The high temperature and moisture of tropical rainforest cause dead organic matter to decompose quickly. So, which will be the answer of this? Correct. Santosh. Femina wrong. Sumo correct. Correct. Shalu wrong. Avni, Vaishna, Sakshi, Pallavi, Anjali correct. Mary correct. Shargun, Shamil, Tarun, Akshita, Chandrasekhar correct. Good. 50% of you have given the correct answer. So here, soil in tropical rainforests are rich in nutrients? No, they are poor in nutrients. Why? Because of high temperature and moisture of tropical rainforest, they cause the dead matter to decompose very quickly. And when the entire process of decomposition is carried out quite significantly at a faster pace, that is when the soil is impoverished of all the nutrients. So here statement 1 is incorrect and statement 2 is correct. Okay? I hope that is understood. Now, after that, we move ahead and we come to the portion of savanna. Correct explanation here in the statement-based question means that why that statement 1 is correct. If the statement 2 is justifying that, that would be the answer. Okay. Here, when we talk about savanna, so savanna is the name which is given to the tropical grasslands. Tropical grasslands. Now here, generally you will have a long dry season with short rainy period of rains. a well-defined dry and wet season. Now here you will find the presence of these grasses. And the grasses basically, they also get very, very dry, very, very dry. Now because you have large stretches of grasses here, you will find the availability of large herbivores, deer population, buffaloes, water buffaloes, etc., wild buffaloes. Then, for example, the elephants. Elephants, by the way, they are also referred to as the gardeners of this savanna ecosystem, right? Because here, these elephants, oftentimes after the rainfall happens, the grasses will grow almost anywhere and everywhere. And these elephants, what they do, they will straight away carry out or uproot a lot of grasses. Some of that they will consume, some of that they will simply throw away. So it is like the process of gardening, where you take care of that excessive growth, you maintain that kind of a level growth everywhere. So that is something which is to be found here. Now, because you have the presence of these large herbivores, the carnivore population can also be found to be existent in this place. In this area, you'll find the carnivore population also to be existent, right? Hippos, etc., will also be there. Now, in this region, this is also spread across various different parts of the world. For example, in South America, you have the region of Campos in the area of the Brazilian highlands, Llanos in the region of Venezuela. Then, for example, in the region of Africa, you have the entire Sahel region to the north of Congo rainforest, right? If I show you, this is where you will find these grasslands in existence all the way here also in India also, around the region of Karnataka, Telangana, in that area, Maharashtra, there you will find these kind of structures or these kind of vegetation. Now, during the dry season, which is very prolonged, the availability of water becomes a scarcity. Now, due to that lack of availability of water, trees won't exist because trees require a certain amount of water. So trees won't be in existence that prominently. Right. And whatever small saplings of trees they are about to grow or in various different stages of growth, when the elephants they walk through that area, they will level that ground in that region. They will bring about the leveling of land in that area. Right. So the elephants, lack of rainfall, etc., doesn't allow the trees to grow. But there is another factor which doesn't allow many trees to grow, other than the dry condition and the presence of these natural gardeners, and that is the events of wildfire. Wildfire is very prominent. And why is that? That is because for the entire duration of the prolonged dry season, eventually, the grasses they become very, very dry. Right? They end up becoming significantly and very dry. So when the grasses become very dry, then they are ideal as a fuel for fire. But then who puts that fire? So before the rains are about to come, there is, for example, development of thunder and lightning. In dry areas, the events of lightning, anyways, are more. So, as that thunder and lightning strikes, immediately the grasses catch fire. Every year, almost in all the tropical grasslands, you have some or the other events of natural wildfire during the dry season. And that again takes care of the fact that even the small saplings, if they are growing, they don't grow quite significantly. Availability of source of water here becomes a challenge, due to which the animals they can migrate for hundreds of kilometers altogether. And it is during this migration where you have new areas of settlement, and also the carnivores basically get the access to food as well. So here, when we talk about it, this is the savanna biome. They are grasslands with scattered trees found in dry tropics, such as East Africa's modest altitude around Tanzania, Serengeti region of Tanzania, Masai Mara region of Kenya. These are areas where you'll find them. Serengeti. Yes, Anurag, correct. So Anurag is saying that savanna is favorite for wildlife documentary makers, which is correct. In fact, any of the wildlife documentary that you see, they will talk about the Serengeti region of Tanzania. They will take you to the Serengeti region of Tanzania very easily, right? Then Masai Mara, Kenya. Kenya. In India also you find it. In the southern part of Africa also you find it. So here, annual rainfall ranges from 90 to 150 centimeter. It is not that high in many of the cases, with a dry spell which is pretty prolonged. So you have a prolonged dry spell and prolonged dry spell, right? Biome is highly influenced by forest fires and sometimes even the human activity. Well, wherever we humans have been to, we have modified the ecosystem. For example, if we talk about the human intervention, I'll come after this particular topic or this particular point. The fauna in the region of the savanna include a great diversity of grazers and browsers, from antelopes, buffaloes, zebras, even giraffes in certain cases, elephants and rhinos, and carnivores, lion, cheetah, hyena, name them, you find them. Now, as I was telling you about human intervention especially is felt in the case of tropical rainforest biome. Here, in the region around Indonesia, in the region around Java, Sumatra, there you have the tropical rainforest. And every year, thousands of hectares of this very critical habitat, very critical ecosystem is cleared off by us humans. And why? In order to cultivate oil palm. Indonesia, I hope we are aware, is one of the largest suppliers of palm oil across the world. We import heavy amount of palm oil from Indonesia. So that is where this critical ecosystem is getting destroyed. Deforestation is happening at a massive rate. And as I was telling you how critical this ecosystem is, we have talked about the fact that larger species are generally not found in tropical rainforest. The exception prevails in the region of Indonesia, in the region of Java, Sumatra. Here, in these dense tropical rainforests, you will find elephants also, you will find rhinos also, you will find the very elusive Sumatran tiger also. So the elephants in the region of Sumatra, they are slightly smaller. When we talk about the Sumatran rhinos, they are also uniquely smaller as compared to their counterparts across the rest of the world. Why is that the case? Why have they been, or why are they being found there when we know that it is an island? How is it that these elephants, these rhinos, how could they reach that tropical rainforest in the middle of an island? That is because it is said, or it is estimated, when they would have been there or when they would have traveled there, that region would not have been an island. It would have been connected by land, as indicated by this image. Eventually, you would have water coming in and separating that area. And ever since that time, those animals, those species, they have evolved in that area. And that is why it represents very unique kind of species that you find in the region of Java, Sumatra, Indonesia. But that critical habitat is being destroyed for the cultivation of oil palm. Okay? Now, then comes the desert biome. Desert means a lack of precipitation. Precipitation is actually very less here. So there is, in general, moisture deficiency, which is a common factor. Moisture deficiency. Significance of Bengal tiger. Bengal tiger is again an apex predator, which is a keystone species, very important for maintaining the ecosystem, very important for maintaining the balance in the ecosystem, keeping the herbivore population in check. One of the most evolved hunters which are out there. But when it comes to one of the most intelligent hunters, intelligence I'm talking about, not evolved. When we talk about the most intelligent hunters out there, the orcas or the killer whales, obviously, they are as intelligent as it can be. Now, moisture deficiency basically here means the species are adapted to the condition of low moisture availability, very low moisture availability. That is what the species they get adapted to. So here what generally happens, either the region will not receive rainfall, even if it receives rainfall, it basically will lose much more due to evaporation. Now, many of the species, they have adapted themselves and their body structure in such a way that they don't need much amount of water. They, the species, they specialize in conserving as much amount of water, recycling as much amount of water as possible. That is why here you will find that the species, they generally don't, even when they discharge urine, urine is in a solid state. They discharge a solid urine, not a liquid urine, because that water is to be utilized. Other than camels, you don't find any large animal to be present here. Again, large animals with large body structure. Why? Because they will be exposed to that heat, right? And that is what they won't be able to tolerate. Majority of the animal species that you find here, they will be nocturnal in nature. Nocturnal. That is, they will be active during the night, dormant during the day. They will hide in their burrows or underneath the sand. In the case of snakes, they can simply hide and slither underneath the sand. Even you have various different categories of smaller rodents which can do that. So during the day, they want to escape the harsh conditions, and during the night, that is when they come out. And yesterday also I told you about this, that you have certain species of frogs, for example, who have the capability to absorb moisture or dew through their outer skin, and that fulfills their requirement of water. Many of the species, for example, few of the species of lizards, right? Now, they are able to, in a way, oxidize their own internal nutrients, the nutrients that they have consumed, and generate the fluid water required for their body structure. So they can go for many days without any exposure or availability of water. Now, in the desert areas, during the night, the temperature gets very, very low. Because during the night, as the air is dry, the land loses heat very quickly. So during the night, the temperature really dips. And that is why you will find many of the species, generally which are active during the night, they will have a coat of fur around them. They will have significant amount of coating of fur around them to protect them during the night time, right? So the normal preconceived notion is that fur is to escape the only in the region of high latitudes, closer to the poles, there only, or in high altitudes, there only the animals will have fur. No, even in desert areas, the animals have fur, and that is to protect them from the extreme low temperatures experienced during the night. That is when they venture out. Now, when we talk about the plant community, the plant community in this area, they are what are referred to as xerophytes. Now, these are very unique kind of plants, because when we talk about the existence of various different plants, any plant, the natural process is that through their leaf structure, the plants tend to lose moisture into the atmosphere through the presence of their leaves, right? So let's suppose you have the any of the plants. So the plants in the leaves, they will have multiple different pores, and through those pores they will lose moisture. Moisture being brought from the roots, absorbed from the soil, and eventually sent through the body systems of the plant and will be lost into the atmosphere. But in the deserts, the plants cannot afford to do that. So the plants go for certain adaptations. In certain kinds of plants, if there are leaves, the leaves will have a waxy coating. And by waxy coating, I don't mean the wax that you see in the candles. By waxy coating means you have a kind of a natural coating which doesn't allow the loss of water. Secondly, you'll find that majority of the plants, they won't have leaves at all. In order to prevent this transpiration from happening, they won't have any leaves at all. So rather than leaves, they will have that green pigmentation in the stem in order to carry out photosynthesis. And those stems, generally, that is where the food is manufactured and the food is stored. That is why you will find in the xerophytes the presence of fleshy stem. The stem is fleshy, significantly fleshy. Aloe vera is an example of that. Cactus is an example of that. Succulent plants that you see, they are an example of that. The stem in itself gets fleshy. Now, here, if the stem consists all the stored food and it is fleshy as well, it is a very easy source of food where immediately any herbivore can come and chomp it off. So that is why in order to protect themselves, the plants, they develop thorns on the outside. That is why you will find the presence of thorny plants in this area. These are the adaptations that the species have to undergo in order to survive in the deserts. Okay, so here, if you take a look at it, basically in the desert biome, you'll find thick, waxy skin for the plants, large, fleshy stems, presence of thorns to protect that, and also you will have widespread root systems. The root systems will be very extensive. Why? In order to fetch for water from wherever possible, right? So that is where, in order to search for water, the roots grow much more extensive in this area. And the plants here, they indicate a kind of an ephemeral characteristic also. And when we say ephemeral, means what? That if it rains even for the shortest duration, immediately they will flower and then it will be done, right? So that is where instantaneously they will flower, and within a few days that flower is gone. So that is where the availability of opportune moist condition is utilized. Then in the animals, the adaptations, thick eyebrows, eyelashes, in order to ward off the dust storm and the sandstorm, which is a commonality, hairy ears and long eyelashes, again for the same purposes, closing nostrils in the case of majority of the camel species that you will find, and that is basically again to prevent that dust from coming in. And then they have a thick fur to protect them from cold conditions during the night, and webbed feet or wide feet in order to take care of the sandy terrain. Okay. Then you have the temperate grasslands. Now, temperate grasslands, these are different from the tropical grasslands. I think the image in itself will be ever so self-descriptive, right? By looking at the image between the tropical grassland and the temperate grassland, easily you can make out that here the moisture availability is significant. There it was very dry. So that appears to look like the poor cousin of this temperate grassland. So here basically in the temperate regions of the world, for example, pampas in the region of Argentina, for example, prairies in the region of US, steppes in Central Asia, right? Downs in the region of Australia, Veld in the region of South Africa, Canterbury in the region of New Zealand. These are the areas of temperate grasslands. Now, in these regions, the temperature is not very high. The amount of rainfall is also not very high, but the rate of evaporation is low. So that is why availability or moisture sufficiency is maintained year out. Okay. Here again, you will find large herbivores. And again, obviously, carnivore population will also, wolves, etc., will also be found in this. So when we talk about the temperate grassland, they are found in regions of prairies, steppes, etc. Because the rainfall is infrequent, organic waste doesn't decompose very quickly. And that is why the soil are rich in organic minerals or materials, always. That is the reason why soil is rich in organic minerals. Now, fauna includes large herbivores like bison, antelope, cattle, rodents, prairie dog, wolves, right? So carnivores are also there. So that is basically the characteristic of this. Then you have the coniferous region in the high latitudes or in high altitudes, in greater heights or in places closer to the polar region. That is where you have these coniferous, conical shaped trees or forest, what is referred to as the boreal forest biome. Now here for majority of the part of the year, the temperature will be very, very low, right? But then here, whenever that snow melt, etc. happens, that is when you will find the trees to be in full bloom, in full greenery. Now, this is also a region which is very rich in organic compounds. Here also, soil is very rich in organic compounds. Why? Because of low temperature, you have slow rate of evaporation. Due to low temperature, very slow rate of decomposition. Very slow rate of decomposition is observed. Moreover, so that is why the soil in these areas, they will be typically dark brownish in characteristic. If you will observe, dark brownish nature of soil will be prominently found. Now, another factor that you can note here, that you will be able to observe here, is the fact that the trees, they will represent that unique conical shape. And even within the trees, the leaves, they will have that needle shape. You won't have the typical broad shaped leaf here. No, you will have that needle shaped leaf. Why? Very simple reason. In order to adapt to very heavy snowfall. If let's suppose a tree would have been such, the normal tree that you see, like this, in case of a heavy snowfall, all this region would be so very heavily laden with snow, these trees would collapse immediately, won't it? So that is why, in order to keep the center of gravity low, observe how the trees, they have adapted. The trees have a kind of a conical shape, so that all that snow will accumulate in the lower portion. It will be strong still. Now the needle-shaped leaf. So imagine if these leaves, they would have a shape somewhat like this, let's suppose. Now all that snow which would accumulate on this, can a leaf withstand that? The leaf will immediately droop, it will immediately fall. A leaf cannot withstand that. So that is why you will have this needle-shaped leaf. So that basically all that snow which will fall will immediately drop over. That is why the needle-shaped leaves are very much a requirement. Okay, so these are the few of the adaptations. So conical structure, of trees, and needle-shaped leaves. Yes, Ritu, to withstand heavy snow. Okay, now this is to be found in the higher latitudes, or even in the case of higher altitude areas. For example, in Uttarakhand also you'll find them. For example, in the region of Himachal Pradesh also you'll find them. In the region of Jammu Kashmir also you'll find them. In some stretches of Sikkim, northern West Bengal, in the region of Arunachal Pradesh in India also you'll find them. Right? So it is found around, otherwise in higher latitudes, 50° north in North America and around 60° north in Europe and Asia. Average annual precipitation is between 40 to 100 centimeter. Evaporation is minimal and the soil remains moist all year round. Right? These are known as taiga forest. Vegetation is made up of evergreen needle-shaped leaves. So moisture sufficiency is maintained because the rate of evaporation is very, very less. And then we come to the extreme temperatures observed in very high latitudes and in very high altitude. That is the tundra biome. Tundra biome is where you have almost the frozen conditions which prevail. Right? So these are found to be present in the region of the poles, the polar areas, etc. Now here, you'll find that either the region is completely frozen throughout the year, or even during the warmer conditions where some portions they start to melt. For example, the coastal areas of Greenland, some of the coastlines across Antarctica, when they melt, you'll find mosses and lichens, they will grow there. Right? That's it. but otherwise completely covered under ice. So this is dominated by mosses in very high latitudes. These are dominated by mosses and lichens, and is a region of permafrost. Permafrost means permanently frozen. Okay, so mosses and lichens. Now, by the way, lichens, they also represent a kind of a symbiotic relationship. Symbiotic relationship between algae and fungi. Okay, so they also represent a kind of a symbiotic relationship. Okay, now here are the typical animals: reindeer, Arctic fox, polar bear, snowy owl, lemming, Arctic hare. So you will not find many of the small rodents, etc., like to be present here. Generally, you'll find larger species. Now, when we come to the aquatic biome, the aquatic conditions have not always been considered as a biome. It is very lately that even these aquatic environments, they are considered as a separate biome. So here, in the aquatic biome, you will find the presence of fresh water, saline water. Now, there are certain factors which are responsible for impacting the amount of productivity carried out in the aquatic regions of the world. So here, when we talk about the factors limiting the productivity of the aquatic habitats, you have the availability of sunlight. Sunlight is very important. Now, when we talk about, for example, rivers or ponds, there sunlight will be able to penetrate to the depth. Now, sunlight is required for what? By the marine plants, by the phytoplanktons, right? The producer community, in order to produce food, the photoautotrophs require the availability of sunlight. Wherever there will be availability of sunlight, there will be greater amount of biodiversity. That is why when we talk about the oceanic region, you have the area up till the depth of 400, 500 meters from the surface, which receives sunlight. And that is the region which we refer to as a photic zone. Whereas you have regions at a depth where no sunlight reaches, that is aphotic zone. So the type of life that you see in the photic and the aphotic zone is very different. It's very varied. For example, in the oceans, the shallowest area where the depth is not very high, that is the region of the continental shelf, right? So those of you are not aware about it. So suppose this is the land area. In the oceans, what happens is this is the kind of a structure or a relief. So here you will find the presence of water body. Okay. Now, these shallow regions in the oceans is what we refer to as the shelf area, continental shelf. Now, these are the regions where sunlight will always be available because the depth is not significant. So here you will find a lot of marine plants to be growing. So just to give you an idea, continental shelves, they represent close to around 8 to 10% of the area of all the oceans taken together. If you consider all the oceans of the world, only 8 to 10% of that area is this shallow or the continental shelf region. You know, these continental shelves, they account for more than 90% of the marine biodiversity in the world. More than 90% of the biodiversity of the oceans is to be found in this area, which tells you wherever there is availability of sunlight, there will be such wide variety of producers that the type of life that they can support will also be immense. So here, important for producer, right? Then dissolved oxygen. Now, dissolved oxygen is very much required to carry out respiration. If Dissolved oxygen is not there, that region gets depopulated, the species they die many of the times in coastal areas sometimes, but in the urban lakes and urban areas in India we observe this quite frequently, particularly in the cities such as Bangalore, Hyderabad, nowadays even Chennai for that matter has been experiencing that, where suddenly out of nowhere you'll find that in an urban lake or a pond suddenly you have 100 dead fishes floating on the surface. Suddenly they have all died because the water has been completely devoid of oxygen. So availability of dissolved oxygen is a must for the survivability of species. And then the adequate temperature, because the marine species, they have very little thermal tolerance. Aquatic species have very less or very limited thermal tolerance. Other than that, salinity is also a factor. The salt content, salinity is also a factor which ends up determining the type of species and the various different biological processes which are carried out. For example, you have certain species of dolphins which you will find only in fresh water. You will have certain species of dolphins which you will find only in marine water. Corals, for example, you will find only in the marine water. Corals you will not find in the fresh water ever, right? Whales, etc., only in salty water or saline water. So that is why even salinity ends up determining where or what will be the distribution of species in different areas. So that also becomes a determining factor. Okay. Now, when we talk about the freshwater ecosystem overall, now freshwater system can be flowing, it can be static also. When you have the water which is flowing in the form of rivers, etc., they are referred to as lotic systems. Okay, so when the flowing freshwater system is present, for example, large rivers, they are referred to as lotic systems. I hope we are aware that, and we will talk about it when we come to water pollution also, that in the overall representation of water available across the planet, all these rivers, ponds, lakes, they only end up making only around 0.4% of all the fresh water. Majority of the fresh water across the planet is actually trapped. Around 70% of the fresh water is trapped in the ice caps and the glaciers and the ice sheets. Around close to around 29 to 30% of fresh water is present underground. Only around 0.1%, 0.4% is available in the form of all the rivers, lakes, and ponds that you see. Now, when we talk about these rivers also represent very unique systems. Here also, you have the flow of the water, oftentimes being so turbid and having such a turbulent flow, you will have a lot of mud carried along, right? So the visibility level is very, very less. But here you have the species which are only adapted or only well versed with the freshwater ecosystem. Example of this, we can take the case of the Gangetic dolphin or the riverine dolphin. Riverine dolphin is of various different categories, subspecies. So when we talk about freshwater dolphin, one of them is Gangetic dolphin. Then other than that, we have the Indus dolphin. Then other than that, you also have the presence of the Amazon dolphin. Then other than that, you also have the Irrawaddy dolphin. Now, Irrawaddy dolphin is a unique case. You have species which are adapted to freshwater also, and you have species which are even to be found in the Chilika Lake, right, where you have salty water. So here, species adapted to fresh water and also certain species living in saline conditions like the Chilika Lake. Like Chilika Lake. It is all about how they have adapted and how they have evolved in the past. Because if you think about it, how can a freshwater dolphin be in existence in River Ganga? And how can a different freshwater dolphin be available and be present in the region of River Indus? Have you ever thought about it? Would it have been the case that there would have been evolution of a separate species of dolphin in Indus and evolution of separate species of dolphin in Ganga? Would that have been the case? No. At one point of time in geological history of this place, all the waters in Indus, Ganga, Brahmaputra, they would actually converge and they would actually have a pool of water in the present day region of the northern plains. And that is where you had these species intermingling with each other, commingling with each other. It was during that point of time that the region of Assam was significantly underwater. And that is why we find crude oil in that area today. So everything follows a certain set of logic in this case. Another kind of very unique species that you find in this area is that of a species of alligator, that is gharials. Gharials are a unique species of alligator with a long snout. In the place of a mouth, they have a very long snout. Now, alligators are unique because they have the ability to withstand various different temperature conditions, various different harsh conditions, obviously not able to withstand hunting. Right, hunting and poaching by humans, well, that is something that they cannot withstand. And we humans, we have hunted these alligators down in order to consume them for meat, in order to actually sell their leather, and then sport those leather belts and those leather apparels. Now, gharials, they have that long snout of a mouth, and they have basically a strong biting force, as is the case with all the alligators, because the alligators have the ability to move both their jaws, right? Generally, they all the species, most of the species that you will find, they will have the ability to move the lower jaw. All of us, when we consume food, when we speak, I hope you would have noticed that in your life by now, that only your lower jaw moves. Your upper jaw is fixed to the skull. Right? In the case of the alligators, both the jaws can move. That is why they have a very strong biting force. That is why the crocodiles can become so very dangerous. Amongst the crocodiles also, you have the saltwater crocodile basically found in the region of Sundarbans, which are very, very large. So gharials are not as big as the crocodiles, but then they are found in these, for example, in India, where do you find the gharials? In the region of Chambal. Historically, however, gharials were to be found in large numbers even across river Mahanadi, even across river Brahmaputra. So Odisha historically had a lot of gharials, and so did Assam. But then we hunted them out, right? We killed them out. Now, Odisha and Assam, both these governments, they are taking incredible amount of planning into place. They are putting that into structure into place in order to bring back the population of gharials in this area, because the gharials are important to keep the fish population in check, right? There also a predator prey relationship is there. So always, in order to maintain that natural balance, you need to have a predator, you need to have the prey. So that is why the gharials, they are being reintroduced in Odisha. Proper care is being taken, and such is the plan with the Assam government also. But naturally, in the region of the Yamuna River basin, that is around the Chambal, you'll find a lot of this gharial population. Okay. Yes, there is a dedicated sanctuary for gharial. Now, when we talk about the static water, water which is standing, now that is what you find in the case of the lakes and the ponds. Now, here, when we talk about the standing water, basically all these lakes, how is it that I'm not talking about the man-made ones, but the natural lakes and ponds, how have they been created? How did they come into existence? Because of geomorphic process and geographical phenomena, where maybe a glacial erosion would have eroded the soil structure so much, created a kind of a depression in that area, right? Maybe there would have been an opening of a fault line, a crack, where you would have a deep depression created, filling it up with water. Maybe there is a rift valley, as is the case with Africa, East African Rift Valley, forming large lakes, Lake Victoria, Lake Tanganyika, and so on. So that is where these lakes and ponds, they get created naturally also due to erosion, fault lines, etc. Now, over a period of time, these lakes, they also end up aging. Just like any landform, just like we humans also, these lakes, they also get old. So what is the difference between a new lake and an old lake? So a new lake which gets created, for example, here, it will have all the water and water will be dominant. As the lake keeps on getting older, slowly and steadily, the sediments from here will drain into the lake. The excess rainfall will drive some sediments into the lake. So slowly and steadily, more deposits starts to happen in these lakes. More deposits, they begin to happen. So the lake gets shallower and shallower. Eventually, all these deposits, when they happen, they can turn this lake into a terrestrial ecosystem also, after obviously a very long period of time. Okay, so here, these are also, by the way, what are referred to as the lentic systems. The flowing water was known as the lotic system. This is also what is known as the lentic system. So the depression might have formed as a result of a glacial activity, fault zone, meteor impact. Meteor impact in India, you have the case of the Lonar Lake, right? Example, Lonar Lake in Maharashtra. Maharashtra. It is a geo-heritage site of India, because this is one of the only few places across the world which has got evidence of what happens in the rock, in the basaltic rock structure when it is hit by an asteroid or a meteorite, what actually unfolds in the rock structure. Now, over a period of time with greater sedimentation, the aquatic system transitions to wet meadows, grassy area, which then transition into terrestrial habitat. Now, many of these lakes, as they get that runoff from the nearby areas, as they get deposits from the nearby areas, they get overloaded with nutrients. As they get older, they get overloaded with nutrients. And that is when they give you this kind of a visual representation. Something which I'm sure, whichever part of the country you are living in, you would have observed this kind of a lake or a pond around you. If any amongst you, you come up and tell me that no, in my region, none of the lakes or water bodies are like that, first of all, I won't believe you. Or in the second case, you have not explored your area, right? Be it the regions of north, south, east, west, center, farthest of the regions we have polluted it. So this is the green film that you see, which develops. And if you would have observed these regions, there's a kind of a foul stench which emanates from that, a kind of a foul smell which comes from that. Wooler Lake, yes, even Wooler Lake has become, that is how even Wooler Lake and Dal Lake also. That is the sad predicament of it. For a significant longer amount of time, these were so pristinely beautiful that images, photographs, and paintings could not do justice to what they would look like. But leave anything to us humans, we know how to spoil what nature has created. If the nature cannot destroy it on its own, we ensure we destroy it. So, why does this happen? Or when does this happen? So, this is when you will find a lot of algal growth. All this green film that you see is nothing but the growth of algae. Now, this is what is also referred to as a harmful algal bloom. Bloom in the sense sudden explosion in the population of algae, sudden explosion. Number of algae will be very, very high. And why will that happen? When the lake gets overloaded with nutrients. Which nutrient are we talking about? Generally, when we think about nutrients, we think about it in positive connotation, that I get these nutrients, my health will improve. But here, we are talking about nutrients such as nitrates and phosphates. Now, when they get overloaded in these lakes, they lead to a bloom in the algal population. So that process of overloading that water body with the nutrients, where the water body gets overloaded with the nutrient discharge, that is what is referred to as eutrophication. So when we say eutrophication, it basically is overloading of aquatic systems with nutrients discharged from nearby runoffs. Example, you have the example of nitrates, phosphates. Now, nitrates are generated from agricultural fields, industrial waste, etc. Whereas phosphates are generated again from agricultural field, untreated sewage, excreta that is, then bones and remains of animals. That is what is referred to as eutrophication. Now, when this process of eutrophication happens, when the lake gets overloaded with these nutrients, then slowly and steadily the health starts to decline. The health of the lake, obviously, that starts to decline ever so slowly and steadily. So, here what you will observe, that eutrophication eventually leads to the harmful algal bloom. And that is when eventually that foul stench starts to come. So, let us understand the entire process of it. So initially, due to high amount of discharge and runoff, eutrophication happens, right? High amount of. So basically, you need an image also in order to visualize that. So if let's suppose you have this kind of a lake structure, let's suppose now if you have water availability in this, right? Now when those nutrients will be supplied, excess nutrients will be supplied, you will find the sudden growth in algal population. Lot of algae will be growing up, lot of them. And algae, they are basically photoautotrophs. They need those nutrients to thrive, and then all that they need other than the nutrients is sunlight. So that is why they start accumulating on the surface in order to have maximum access to sunlight available. Okay, so here basically when we talk about eutrophication or overloading of nutrients, leads to growth of algae, right? Generally, blue-green algae is something that you find, but you have various red algae is also something that you find. But generally, blue-green is the dominant one. Blue-green. Okay. Now, as this algae, they start to dominate, what will they do? They will start blocking the sunlight as they dominate the surface. Here you can see they have covered the surface with a kind of a film. So, here, excessive nutrients means more algae. They develop on the surface and they are able to block the sunlight. Develop on surface, right? And block sunlight. Now, as they block the availability of sunlight, what does that mean? Is actually that now the availability of sun for the smaller marine plants or the other marine plants, they won't get the availability of sunlight as well. So marine plants, or rather than marine, let me write aquatic here. Aquatic plants do not get sunlight. So as they don't get the availability of sunlight, these aquatic plants, they start to die. Aquatic plants die. Now, when the aquatic plants die, availability of oxygen, supply of oxygen into the water body is interrupted or is hampered. In the meanwhile, when you have this overgrowth of algae, they will also eventually die off. They will also come through their life cycle, they will also die. So when this algae dies, they start getting deposited at the bottom of this lake or this water body. And as they get deposited, that is when this is dead organic matter. Decomposers take over. You have various different aerobic bacterium which carry out that process of decomposition. And as they will carry out that process of decomposition, they will utilize more oxygen. They will emanate heat and gases like methane. That is why you have that foul stench or the foul smell coming from that part, because you have decomposition going on underwater. So here, basically, at this stage, large amounts, numbers of algae also die, get deposited at the bottom. After that, are worked upon or decomposed by bacterium or bacteria rather. Now, this consumes dissolved oxygen, because we know that for in order to carry out the process of decomposition, you do need the availability of moisture, you do need the availability of oxygen, and you need warmer temperature also. So all of that will be utilized. So consumes dissolved oxygen of the water, and at the same time emits very foul smell. Very foul smell, and gases like methane and sulfide. Meanwhile, here also oxygen is getting dissolved. So water, as a result of both these events, water is deprived of oxygen. Rest of the species, remaining species, also die, and you have creation of a dead zone of dead zone. Right? That is how generally the sudden bloom, the growth in the population of the algae, that is basically what creates this particular scenario, this particular issue. Okay. And eventually, that is in these areas, you will find that suddenly all these dead fishes, they come floating on top of water. It is not something which has happened in one day. It is something which has been happening continuously, where the water has been getting devoid of oxygen, eventually creating a kind of a dead zone or hypoxic water. Such waters are also known as hypoxic water. Even these will be then decomposed. They will also emanate the same smell. So this sudden growth in the population of the algae, that is what is also referred to as the harmful algal bloom. So here, sudden and rapid growth of algae, that is what is also known as harmful algal bloom. Okay, use this flow chart, use this data flow. Questions from eutrophication are always asked. Many of the times it is repeated in the mains examination, in the prelims examination also. So if you are able to represent this kind of a flow chart in the case of the mains examination, it saves a lot of time, and it is much more pictorially representative also. It is sure to give you or fetch you greater amount of marks. Okay, please have this flow chart with you. Try to have it or frame it on your own as well. Okay, now that is the case of eutrophication and the harmful algal bloom, and depending upon what kind of algae actually grows, such kind of a coloration is given. For example, if the blue green algae dominates, you have that green film which develops. For example, in certain areas such as Florida in US, now Florida is the southeastern state in United States, where you have one of the larger wetlands across the world, and that is the Everglade wetlands, right? Everglade wetland is a kind of an ideal case study to study about the sudden boom in the population of the pythons out there. Burmese python, we will cover it at some other time. We will have that discussion about the Burmese python, how people introduced them in that area, and now they can't get rid of it. Now it has become a menace in that region. Now, in that Everglades region of Florida, you have sometimes you have, and in the adjoining water body also, sometimes you have the growth of that red algae. Now that red algae, again, here also You have very foul stench emanating, stench which is very akin or very similar to something decomposing out there. So you have that foul stench which keeps on emanating. And that is where it is known as the red tides. So when we say the red tides, it is not that it is a unique kind of a tide where there is a kind of a wish of of or a curse of someone, that is why it has become red, it becomes red under full moon, etc. No, it is not any supernatural factors are not involved here. You have that growth of red algae which takes place. Again, it is a kind of a harmful algal bloom, and that is why you have the presence of these red tides. Okay. Chandrasekhar, is need to maintain the same pattern of flowchart? Absolutely not, my dear friend. Absolutely not. I am a firm believer of the fact that you guys can be much more creative than what I am, right? So please try to inculcate that and try to replicate it on your own. Okay, it might be possible that in that replication you might come across some amount of innovation. You might have a better innovation also. And if everybody will replicate the same, everybody, I hope everybody is not expecting the same marks in the examination. I hope we are not that communist in our mindset that, okay, give the same marks to all of us, we'll be happy. No. I hope in terms of marks, we are quite capitalist in the mindset that everything should come here. So try to have that innovation. How algae died? The life process takes over. Basically, they will also come across the end of their life cycle, isn't it? Dissolved oxygen reduced due to photosynthesis by blue-green algae. No, shallow dissolved oxygen here reduces because of two factors. First of all, that green algae covers the surface, so sunlight is not able to penetrate to the depth. So the aquatic plants, which were generating that process of photosynthesis, they won't be producing oxygen anymore. So that is one supply which is cut short. Then whatever dissolved oxygen is there in the water, that will be consumed by the bacteria who are carrying out the decomposition of the algae. So there also dissolved oxygen is consumed. So that is where dissolved oxygen, eventually the proportion gets very less. Femina, can we say example of water hyacinth for eutrophication? Eutrophication, see, eutrophication is what? Overloading by nutrients. When you have overloading by nutrients which is there, that is what we refer to as eutrophication. The impact of it can be growth of harmful algal bloom, or impact of it can also be the growth of certain invasive alien species such as water hyacinth. Okay, so harmful algal bloom is a effect of eutrophication. Sometimes water hyacinth and the sudden bloom in water hyacinth is also an effect of eutrophication, not an example of eutrophication. I hope you understand the difference. Okay. Eutrophication takes place only in standing water in most of the cases. In most of, even where you observe it sometimes happening across the rivers, you'll find it happens in those sections of the rivers where the flow is absolutely limited. Can photosynthesis occur in blue-green algae? Yes, Shalu, it can. Right? And I had a question by XY. How can we restore the eutrophicated area? So, what is done? Many of the lakes have been reclaimed in our country itself. What is done? First of all, from the surface, this algal mass is removed. It appears like a slimy, slithery mass that is removed. Now, once that is removed, then with the help of excavators, you basically dig out the lot of sedimentation and the accumulation of waste which has happened. You dig that out. In that process, you also tend to remove the dead algae which is there. Then you allow the water to replenish itself from the groundwater supply, rainwater. Within one season of rains, that lake will be restored to its pristine beauty. Now, here, then we come across the last set of terminologies after which we will end the session, and that is biological oxygen demand and the chemical oxygen demand. What is it? So, when we talk about the requirement of oxygen or the process of decomposition, wherever process of decomposition will be carried out, oxygen will be required, right? At some form or the other, oxygen will be required. Now, when we talk about the region of these water bodies, these water bodies will have organic waste, some inorganic waste also. Decomposition or digestion of any of this will require oxygen. So when we say the term biological oxygen demand, it refers to the total amount of oxygen which will be required in order to decompose all the organic contaminants which are there in the water body. I will repeat. Biological oxygen demand of a water body is the total amount of oxygen, dissolved oxygen, which is required to decompose all the organic contaminants and pollutants in the water body, be it excreta, dead animals, dead species, everything. But then what is chemical oxygen demand? Chemical oxygen demand is the total amount of oxygen, dissolved oxygen required in order to decompose both the organic and also to decompose and break down the inorganic pollutants of the water body. So here, oxygen required to decompose all organic pollutants in the aquatic body. And COD is basically oxygen required for both organic and inorganic contaminants. So here, basically, if I tell you that a particular water body has got a very high oxygen demand, a very high BOD, does that mean that the level of pollution is high, or does that mean the level of pollution is low? If I tell you, I'll repeat, if I tell you that any water body has got a very high biological oxygen demand, the level of pollutant is high in that water body or the level of pollutant is low? Very good. That means the level of pollution is very high. That is why you need that much amount of oxygen in order to decompose that, digest that. Now, out of these two, always you will find that COD is always larger than BOD. Why? Because COD represents the amount of oxygen required to decompose both organic and inorganic contaminant or pollutant. Whereas when we talk about BOD, it is only the amount of oxygen required to tackle the organic contaminant or organic pollutant. Okay, so this is only for organic, this is for both organic and inorganic. So in an aquatic system, obviously, sum total of organic and inorganic pollutants will be much more, right? So that is what is the concept of these BOD and the COD. Okay. Santosh, how it is high or why it is, Chandrasekhar, formula for dissolved oxygen is same? Yes. Santosh, why it is high is the pollution is high. What is oxygen demand? Oxygen demand here does not mean that what is it that the fishes require. When we say oxygen demand, so for the process of decomposition to happen, oxygen is required, right? So when we say biological oxygen demand is high, means there is so much amount of organic pollutants that all that oxygen will be consumed to digest those organic pollutants. That is why we say it is high. Okay. So that is where we'll restrict the session here for today. And we'll meet again next week, I think on Tuesday. Till that time, do enjoy the weekend, relax on the weekend. Let us take a few questions till then. Shargun, for nocturnal animals, can we take the example of an owl as they are? Yes, absolutely. They are example of nocturnal animals. And Shalu, the lake with aquatic flower covering the entire surface. No, that can be a result of eutrophication, but mostly you will find that certain invasive alien species, they come over and they take over. Do you give us map pointing, Sakshi? That is given in the geography classes, my dear friend. And Any example of inorganic contaminants? The concrete slabs, etc., that you throw into it. Okay. Monday, you don't have a class. Monday is a holiday. If a tropical rainforest or equatorial forest is cleared, will it be unsuitable for agriculture? You have to enrich the soil with various fertilizers, obviously, and then you can carry out the cultivation. If extinction is the reality, then one day all the efforts we put for climate change, running behind competition, etc., in our world will become nothing. Absolutely agreed. But does that mean that we wait for that extinction to happen? We might all die much before that. So better make something of our lives, isn't it? Chemical oxygen demand, Gulam, is basically the amount of oxygen required for digesting, decomposing both organic and inorganic pollutants. Okay. In water, what are the decomposers? The bacterium, the microorganisms, parasites, etc. And Chandrasekhar, I'm not understand when soil is rich in organic matter. See, when the decomposition process, as long as it is being carried out, decomposition of organic matter in the soil, it will have organic content. When the process of decomposition is completed, entirely completed, at that point, no organic component. Right. So when you have the development of humus, that is still the fourth stage of decomposition, not the final stage. Development of humus means you have organic component in the soil. But when the process of decomposition after that also carries out, even that humus is taken away, poor in nutrient. So if the rate of decomposition is very high, all the 5 stages of decomposition will happen in one go. And in that case, the soil will not have any organic component at all. If the rate of decomposition is slow, for a longer period of time, that organic component will be available. Means soil is fertile. I hope that makes some sense. Ananya, COD is higher than BOD. It is in terms of oxygen demand of the pollution factor. Yes, correct. And Devansh, tropical. Yes, Santosh, more than sufficient. And Devansh, tropical grasslands, evaporation is greater than precipitation. And temperate, yes, Devansh, that is correct. Do we need to read all the articles for Down to Earth? No, no, just browse through them, Ragini. So with that, we end the session here today. We meet again on in next week. Do revise, take care of yourself, relax. Goodbye. Have a good night. Thank you.